not going to be a dictator, are you? I said, no, 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 other than day one.
Welcome to Dissecting American Dictatorship. To those who were tuned in to 1.0, welcome back. To those who are new to 2.0, in Navigating American Dictatorship, we talked about what is dictatorship as a creature, as an energy, as a dynamic. And we did this sort of with the idea, the metaphor, you're going down a river, you're in a canoe or kayak or whatever, and you're looking ahead, where are the logs bobbing under the water that could bring you down, where are the waterfalls, where are there rivers coming in, where's a grizzly looking for salmon. So to navigate is to look for what's possible, both ways out, ways forward, and what could impede your journey. So in 1.0, we talked about we have this new situation. America's never had an outright dictatorship, and now there seems to be a new president, or a renewed president rather, who says that this is one of his goals. He said that numerous times. I'm just quoting the man. Under Dissecting American Dictatorship, this is different. The focus is not just on how does a dictatorship function, Soviet Union, North Korea, in the past, Third Reich, in the present, Turkey, if you will, or Hungary with its fascism light. So not only what's coming to us from up downward, but what's happening on the ground. As I've said in the last series so many times, my case study, my definitive, informative case study is the Third Reich. I studied the Third Reich and Nazi Germany many, many years. And so this is where I always go to look for indications, the tea leaves of time. I have German relatives in what's now the former east of Germany and the former west. I'm half German American. My people have been in North America since 1630, but half of my ancestors from Europe came from German areas. And so I would identify with the whole German experience. And I can tell you that, unfortunately, what happened in January, February of 1933, when the Nazis finally took power for the last time, didn't just happen overnight. As I explained in more detail in Series 1.0, there was a long dance of the Germans with power sharing, failures to share power, an attempted democracy. There was an attempted Soviet declared, I think, 1919 from the balcony of the former Emperor's Palace. So what happened with the Nazis didn't just happen from what was imposed from the top, but from what was tolerated, what was condoned implicitly and explicitly from the bottom. So in Dissecting American Dictatorship, I don't want to just look at the people at the top who have the most power, the Elon Musk of our day, Donald Trump, all the other players, but what's happening on the bottom, what's been all of our role, and this has been able to come to pass. I rather dissect the white liberals. Some would think that I belong to that group. Sometimes I have, but I would say that I'm more centrist, and I'm very critical of white liberals, if you will. One has heard in the past series, and I'll say again, my criticism of the Democratic Party. I think it's a syndicate. But I also then take time and I dissect the right. And what's the problem with the right? Part of the worldwide drift to the right is people not thinking enough or thinking socially, thinking about what's good for the collective. So welcome to 2.0. Grab your seat, hang on, it's going to be quite a ride, and I will look at a smorgasbord of factors and topics. Thanks, and welcome. Welcome to Dr. Louis Trams's Trump-era teach-ins. The topic at the moment is conclusions. So much has happened in the last week when a team and I began to edit this series. Since I left Ireland on Monday, it feels in so many ways like a different world. The collapse of the Bashar al-Assad regime in Syria says a lot about dictatorship at all. We've been talking about the rise of dictatorships, how they survive and how they fail. We'll get back to this in a second. And the other topic I want to talk about at some point before we conclude these critiques and conclusions, Luigi Mangione. Yeah, what does it have to do with each other? So a dictator in Syria, and I'll get to that. So since the Assad family, once had with a different name, meaning mighty beast, now Assad means lion, that's how they came to power, maybe was being like a mighty beast. Since the Assad family came to power in the early 1970s, it has evolved and devolved to the point where the last years it's been what's now revealed as a narco state. Not only did the regime have secret and well-known prisons, torture areas throughout the country, underground, above ground, in the countryside, in the city, it was also processing narcotics, and to a large degree funding its projects through the sale of these illicit drugs. What's interesting and edifying for our purposes is looking at the Assad family. You can Google it as I did and see that there were numerous brothers and a sister at one point. And the power ultimately fell when the father passed to the dentist's son. I think maybe he'd even studied or practiced in England, as my memory has it. What was important was that there was this family agreement. All those sons had their fingers in many pots. Now we know narcotics production and sales, but also weapons sales, human trafficking, torture. Torture is a business after all. People get paid. Guards, torturers, the bookkeepers, the people who do the stenography. Yeah, it's a sick industry. So the Assad clan was full of despotism, where throughout their kingdom, the dictatorship, but we'll call it a kingdom, different family members played different roles and they got taken care of. And all the people who fed them, and I don't mean literally food, but who kept them going, also benefited from the system in so many different ways. I think of this because at the moment, I'm just trying to report, let's neither left nor right, but up front. At current count, Donald Trump Jr. is said to be the first son. In the olden days when the United States was still a colony of England, there was a king on the throne, and for a long time, we were run by a king, although from a distance. And the first sons were those from aristocratic families who were the firstborn sons, and they, under primogeniture, stood to inherit everything. Often the second sons or third sons or fourth sons became a local vicar or maybe a professor, but the first son was the cream of the crop, and it seems to be happening in the case of the Trumps. Ivanka's the second child, as I remember. She and her husband, Jared Kushner, profited a great deal from the first Trump administration, 2017 to 2021. What's interesting now is that Jared's father, who was in prison for financial wrongdoings, has now been appointed the ambassador to France. I don't know what role Ivanka and Jared might play in this administration. In the teens, he was supposed to go to the Middle East and create peace. I don't know how much peace he created. It doesn't seem like a very peaceful place today. But I do know he made a lot of deals with Saudi Arabia, and there's some sweet deals in many of those mushrooming towns on the coast for golf course franchises and towers with Trump on it. And so he made a good piece of money for dad-in-law and for himself. I'm sure he's not a pauper. And Ivanka isn't baking cookies to send their kids to private schools. But what's really interesting then is Eric. And even though I enjoy watching Stephen Colbert, let's give Eric a break. I mean, I was a second son, and I know that feeling, and it wasn't always pretty. It's his wife that bothers me. So the patriarch, Donald Trump, of the clan I'm talking about, let's try to keep it factual, has asked Marco Rubio, who he used to mock in public and say horrible things about, really nasty things, is now going to join the administration, supposedly. I don't know if there'll be a Senate approval process or not. There's talk that Trump would like to bypass all that. But Donald Trump wants his daughter-in-law, Laura Trump, a former personal coach. She should be a senator from Florida. Then there's Tiffany with her husband Michael. Excuse me if I butchered the last name, but it's Boudous, I'm sorry, it's a Lebanese name. The father-in-law, Massad, is now being appointed the advisor on Middle East issues. What's interesting is that he was an immigrant from Lebanon. There are lots of immigrants in Trump's family. I'm surprised that Donald Trump is so anti-immigrant. But he says himself he's not been in the Middle East for years. What alarms me is that we have a situation like when there were kings in Europe and queens, and we'll get back to that in a second, or current dynasties. Look at the Kim family in North Korea. We know that a lot of cousins and relatives have been held in check or even assassinated to not threaten Kim Jong-un's hold on the country. I don't know what Xi Jinping in China might have going on. I don't think anybody really hangs around Vladimir Putin too long, whether by choice or not, to take over power. But with the case of kings, back when we had the good old institution of rule by birth, not by merit or public service, kings often had their sons, their princes, and their daughters, the princesses, put strategically through the kingdom or through Europe to keep power. Here in what's now Germany, but Germany's a young country. It was only founded in 1871, like Italy. Italy is also a young country. They're quite young. You had all these little kingdoms and duchies, and so the sons would call the shots, create businesses, be involved with the burgeoning lane of trains as of 1835. Kings themselves often got involved with colleges. Like in Dresden, there was the Saxon King's College for Technology. The Prussian King in Berlin, this was the thing, the cutting edge of technology. Movable print was already well used, but to multiply that, Germany became a center of printing books, postcards, calendars, maps. So the kings and their first sons were all about business. The daughters were married off to network so that you wouldn't necessarily go to war next week with the kingdom on the other side of the mountain range. And also you could make deals. Deals. The art of the deal. So in the olden days, when we called them kings, and they were proper monarchs, this is how it worked. It was nepotism, and you kept it in the family. The problem is, with incest, some of them were misfits, mentally limited. Some of them had physical ailments, like the later Emperor of Germany, Kaiser Wilhelm. When you have people in power, that much power on the surface in public service, you have the risk that you have people in positions that don't really know what they're doing. You have people who, because of family connections only, from genetics or a marriage ceremony or not, just shocking up in the modern era, they have access to all this power. And some of them have responsibility for their area. And if they're not appointed because of merit or having worked through the system, either the academic system or the industrial system or the financial system or the governmental system where you actually elect people, local representative and then state representative, and go up to Congress to become, okay? So if you don't have people there by what they know or what they've watched and observed and learned, their performance is quite bad. It's limited. Even if they do their best, let's give them, a bit of a doubt here. They just don't have the experience of the training. And so we all suffer. We all suffer from bad decisions, like someone soon to be in charge, apparently, of public health who doesn't believe in vaccines. Yesterday or so, Mitch McConnell, who survived polio as a boy, came out and said, well, polio vaccines are pretty important. Myself, I'm worried about what will happen to our country and what will happen to the world if we have all these unqualified people who are there only because they're part of the plunder society, this clique, this elite that's taking power. What will be the effects and how many people suffer? In this case I just cited, how many children will be born in the near future with polio or some other ailment that was totally avoidable. So people will pay long term. There'll be real consequences of these decisions and these lack of qualifications. This is a problem. The Assad regime, like the Nazi regime before it and other dictatorships, was running on fumes. Yes, they had some natural resources. They're in the middle of the Middle East with all the oil running around, all the guns being transported and sold and resold, and they're a very profitable thing, I'm told. But how much was being generated? We have 1 million to 1.5 million Syrian refugees here in Germany, and I'm very impressed. They speak German probably better than I do, and they do speak better than most of the refugees. When the war broke out in the Ukraine, I bought a house as part of my mother's inheritance, and we've had to date 57, I think it's soon going to be 59 Ukrainian refugees. In general, they have language challenges. The Syrians, who were also refugees, they're really applying themselves, and now we have a lot of Syrians in hospitals, in drugstores, what we call apothecaries, translated to English. So the Syrians have done really well. They're clever people, and I think Angela Merkel knew that when she said, oh, we'll take them. I will say, and this is a topic for the future, that Afghani refugees and Iraqi, let alone Libyans, have not been favored as Assyrians. Merkel knew exactly what she was doing. Maybe she and her husband had a vacation in Damascus or somewhere looking at Roman ruins out in the sand. So, like so many dictatorships in so many eras around the world, the Assads were running the country into the ground. We see this in Venezuela. Nicolas Maduro inherited what had been one of Latin America's richest countries, Venezuela, another petrol state, and now it's one of the poorest. People can barely feed themselves. Hunger is a real problem in a country that used to have luxury and opulence everywhere. So my fear for our country and the world is these people who are only there for power's sake, not to serve, other than themselves, will run us all down. The very departments they're being appointed to, assuming that they are approved or Trump catapults them into power without approval, they will all suffer. Education, transportation. Don't we have a government to govern? I vote for Kamala Harris. She's okay. She'd be professional, I think. She would have had people on the different topics, on transportation issues, on energy issues. But now instead of governing, we have a business clique who will only be focusing primarily on their own advancement, not of the country, Remember what I said about the Nazis? Hitler always talked about das Volk, das Volk, das Volk. And at the end, when push came to shove, he didn't give a damn. He was willing to sacrifice so many young men fresh out of school, 14, 15 in the last months of the war. Old men, 60, you had to serve the call for the draft. At 60 at the end, saying old men who could barely carry their guns. So this is the danger of dictatorship. This is why democracy, as messy and slow as it can be, has more chance to raise the greater welfare of more people than when you have just an elite, a clique, taking care of their own backside through whatever deals, through whatever shady, untransparent connections. And this is a problem. This is why in the West, in the last 100 or more years, democracies have thrived in countries that thrive. It's a symbiotic process, isn't it? The rise of the middle class in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, putting the power of the church in check and saying, all right, we're going to call some shots here, supporting education, job creation, later environmental protection. All those things will be gambled away for whose gain, not the public's. Making a great arch now to something that at first glance may not seem related, but it does have to do with power. One of the weaknesses we have in the modern world with our social media and the instant reaction to things without really thinking and having time to chew on things is the desire to think in black and white terms and to act like that, like the world is really black and white, which in my experience has always been gray, no matter what. It's also been a difficult thing in certain circles of the United States. I come from rural Iowa, from the heartland, that people could truly believe and understand that two opposing truths could be true at the same time and still be true, but be diametrically opposite. I'm thinking of Josh Shapiro, the governor of Pennsylvania. I agree with him. There's no doubt. We can't live in a world where if we don't agree with someone or we don't like what they're doing, we go kill them, take them down the streets, blow up their car when they commute to work, bomb their houses. We can't live like that because it doesn't stop. I see so many examples throughout history and in the world today where this is the case. It cannot work. We cannot tolerate this. At the same time, there's a problem with truth. What is truth is a debatable concept. I keep striving to find the things that are as most factual as possible. Who comes, who goes, who rules, who creates, who destroys, who has a relationship here, who has a connection there, who has the knowledge. I try to keep it factual and then make conclusions. How do these different parts fit together? So when I listen to the manifesto of Luigi Mangione, I think there's some truth there. And I'm afraid of it. For example, what I remember, and I have been reading quite a bit because it interests me, his comments about you can't change the system without violence. I was draft registration resistor when I was 17. That's part of what got me to the Quakers, which began this whole process, moving abroad. I've been a peacenik most of my life. Lived in a commune, went to peace workshops, social activism. I have to admit, it's very frustrating. I'm not likely to go out and take out some people, get rid of the neighbor who mows his lawn on Sunday and disturbs the peace, or other extremes that are real. But the core problems tend either to take care of themselves, and usually not very neatly, not very well, or they don't really get resolved, at least not to the well-being of the majority of people. And I can see, in a world where we once had a democratic United States, at least in theory, citizens could reach their representatives, bills could be proposed, some of them passed, laws would take effect, the judicial system would oversee challenges to them, and they'd be chewed on. And there'd be new input and new developments and more public conversation. But when you have representatives who, not all, but in too many cases, are there for their own self-aggrandizement and wealth, they're not minding the public store. There's no one to go to. And when 2/3 of the current Supreme Court is going to be a cover girl for the Trump dynasty to do what it wants, vis-a-vis the recent ruling that the president's immune. Why would you do that? Why isn't a congressperson immune, or the public dog catcher, or the sheriff, governor? Why the president? And why this president? Anyway, that's another topic. So if changing the system legitimately through the system will work less and less, and any successes will come harder and harder by more effort and more suffering, what's left? An aside, Brian Thompson, the victim, was a fellow Iowan of mine, as I understand it, a fellow farm boy from Jewel. Jewel is only 60 kilometers or 40 miles due south on Highway 69 from my people's town that the Luigs founded when they came from Germany. Straight down. Even though I never met Brian Thompson, as far as I know, I have a feeling that I know him and his people. They're my people. The world, the system, is full of people who rise through the system, often without any mean intent, consciously, but they carry out things that hurt people. My father, just up the road from Brian Thompson's people, died largely because he couldn't get the heart surgeries that he needed. The story that Mom told, a lifelong Republican until then, was that during the operation, the doctor came out and said, you have to pick either, I think it was angiogram or a bypass or something. Anyway, 2 procedures wouldn't be paid for by the insurance. She had to pick. My mother was lovely, but she was an Iowa farm woman who had no higher education beyond high school. How could she make this decision? And in a rush, while her husband's in the operation table, it came down to money, dollars and cents. So there's a system in place, and people get ground up by the system. And Luigi Mangione said, this has got to stop. What his horrific act, which on a moral plane is unexcusable, has done is brought attention to this problem. Ideally, there would have been other ways to do this. Petitions, writing to Congress people. The thing is, folks, chances are good that sort of activism will increase from both the far right and the far left, or even by people who are politically unaligned, like myself. I'm not a registered Democrat, and I won't be, and I ran for U.S. Senate as independent. When people have the conviction that they cannot change the system, they turn to violence. Many of us Americans, we go to Europe, we think it's really great. We overlook 2 things. All those castles and all those palaces and all the thrones and the jewels were the byproducts of people like the Assads and Kim Jong-un. They're the ones who lived behind high fences and walls and had lots of guards. And it was the Tsar of Russia who began the Gulag system in Siberia. It wasn't the Bolsheviks. They took it over happily. But the European monarchies were very suppressive. And the worst things that we rebel against have historical precedents. In the 1800s, there were rashes of assassination attempts by anarchists, there was a movement, and by others. And the whole idea was, we can't change the system. The clique in power won't let us. Talking to any puppet, Duma or Reichstag or Assemblée Nationale is pointless. We don't have that kind of time. We'll be dead by the time any real change takes place. So we have to act. I don't agree with that philosophy. I mean, in theory, I'm a pacifist. Although now, since the invasion of Ukraine by Russia changes that for me in many ways, you can't just go around and kill people, can you? So here we have this young man who told his truth. And the public reaction implies that especially younger people, but people throughout the age spectrum, agree with that truth. That truth is theirs too. Certainly my family, we lost our patriarch through this insurance miserliness. But as it has to do with dictatorship, there's actually a bigger issue. So I said in other segments that besides crisis and conflicts, dictatorships need a coalescing public and cannot stand competition. And at least the ascent to power had to have some messianic element. Well, here you have a young man who fits some of the bill of being messianic himself. I don't know him. I don't think that he's deranged. He might be deluded, but I don't think he's mentally ill. He was before very successful, as the system deemed success in the American culture. But he's told a truth, which it seems many people in public office at the highest levels are not doing. Mitch McConnell has no honor. Lindsey Graham, our new vice president soon, who once said Trump was a threat, and now he works for the man. So Luigi, by his act, has taken a very strong stand and said this is not tolerable. It has to change. As the U.S. political system becomes more and more calcified and the options for change limited, ever narrow, there'll be more and more people, I presume, don't want to say predict, but I presume, who will turn to violence to change the score. They won't tolerate it. They'll find the situation intolerable. You will have this happening more. You also have young people, older people, men, women, white, black, whatever, who will rise, and for at least a while, until they're knocked down, people in the public will admire them and support them and maybe mimic them. But instead of popular social movements, we get these hits, these surgical strikes. Instead of the crime-ridden system we have now and so many senseless killings and woundings by guns from criminals, people doing something, it'll become a new aspect of American life, political violence, which we largely haven't had since, for example, the 1970s with Patty Hearst and her people and the Panthers. And This is something we've not had to deal with for a long time. This is part of that shock I talked about earlier, that people don't want change they can't cope with. It's stressful. It only facilitates more stress, and it grows, and the society becomes more burdened and begins to shake and sway, and things can explode. And so a dictatorship, especially as it's going down on the way out, brings in this huge explosion. Think of literally fuels that burn and they consume flammable things around them. It was interesting, the New York Times talked about a woman who met with people who'd been in the Assad inner circle, and they said that as he was losing power, he lost his grip on reality. Hitler, it was the same situation. Watch Der Untergang, I think in English it's called The Downfall. It's a very good theatrical cinematographic depiction of the last days. And it's clear that, Hitler, at least in this rendition, Hitler's giving orders that have no relationship to reality. And he's focused on things that really don't matter, while Germany is crumbling up above ground. He's down below, living in parallel reality. Stalin, it is said, when the Germans invaded in 1941, he went into a crisis for a while. He disappeared because he couldn't cope that his clever little deal with the Nazi regime just a few months earlier collapsed and helped bring the Wehrmacht into his own country. He went into shock. So these people are living in their own little film in their head. In German it's called Kopfkino, a film in their head. And so when the reality that's really happening, the truth, is so undeniable, they begin to deny things inside. Well, it's one thing if you're running Liechtenstein, but when you're running the United States, and you're already 78, and at some point, this is all going to collapse, I think, based on historical precedents. It's very likely. What will a desperate president or vice president, or now we have the family involved everywhere, some slighted, angry second son or son, daughter, or in-law, or what were they willing to do? Grandpa has his finger on the button. There are very real consequences here. We're talking about real-life threats that would affect us all on the planet we live on. That's a problem. Welcome to Dr. Louis Trems's Trump-era teach-ins. Today we're talking about critiques. For this series, I've tried my best. I'm also just a person, although as a person I'm allowed to have opinions. But I've tried as best I could to keep those in the background. Of course, they color what I talk about and how I talk about it. But in general, I try to talk about people, biographies, events, wars, economic cycles, history. Not just my own philosophy, philosopher farmer here, right? But with this concluding, for now, segment, I want to critique why I keep saying neither right nor left, but up front. I believe the Democratic Party is a syndicate. I ran for U.S. Senate in 2016. I met, I think it was 3 other men who were running for a year for the Democratic nomination as the U.S. Senate candidate from Iowa to take Charles Grassley's place, the man that my mother wrote to when Dad died of his heart failure. They had traversed the state for months, for a year, like to every corner of the state, shaken hands, kissed babies, the whole thing, talked about policies. But the DNC, the Democratic National Committee, in all of its lack of wisdom and the dues it owed people, wrote a Dear John letter, which I heard them by coincidence. I was in the men's room at a college debate where they all were, and saying they'd all gotten this letter. Thank you for your service, but we're choosing Patty Judge. And this is how this crash and burn candidacy of a woman nobody really wanted took place. A woman who hadn't been running. In fact, probably didn't even know she was going to run until shortly before she was appointed and anointed. You could say this happened with Hillary Clinton. I don't know the dynamics. I was privy to this on the state level in Iowa. What happened with the Democratic candidates for the U.S. Senate in 2016. I don't know what happened on the presidential national level with her, but I can imagine it's similar. The Democratic National Committee has favors to pay. They have their favorites who will toe the line, who might offer change but not change things too much, because that wouldn't be tolerated, would it? So it's a syndicate, understandably. It's also one of the oldest parties in the world, surviving, functioning parties. I would say it's but calcified. I said that as a candidate. And yes, I knew I'd never win against Charles Grassley. That wasn't the point. That's another talk. But I'm critical, having seen all the white liberals in Iowa interview the Democratic and Republican candidates for office and not the independents, of which I was one. There was a libertarian candidate. I liked Chuck very much, Aldrich, but there's a big difference. I actually do believe in government, and I think we need to have a good one. And then there was another man who wasn't a serious candidate, and I actually resented him wasting the public's attention on what was a sociological courses gag. He was a community college professor. But I saw how the mainstream media rubbed us out. We resorted to picketing the Des Moines Register, the sidewalk, and they called 13 police officers and 8 vehicles to come and monitor 2 men with placards saying, "We want an interview. We're on the ballot." This is all outlined in my book, Turkey Foot. Yes, one word, turkey foot. It's a prairie grass that grows in Iowa. I outline what happens to independent candidates in the Midwest in the modern era. And the people who were sabotaging me the most, they weren't the Republicans. They were white liberals, Democrats. Iowa Public Television, Iowa Public Radio, the Des Moines Register. The only real support and audience I had was the Cedar Rapids Gazette. I loved those people because we had serious discussions with a roundtable of 3 or 4 journalists present. We had real talks. They really cared. I had to beg to the Des Moines Register to get an appearance by a woman who was only half-heartedly really interested. So I lived this, that there is a democratic machinery, and unfortunately, the ultimate lever is pulled in Washington. When I claimed that Patty Judge was not a popular candidate, I'm not imagining this. In Johnson County, which is where Iowa City is, the University of Iowa, I was there for Gay Pride. I often went to Gay Pride because those are my people and I wanted their support and petition signatures, etc. On the Democratic float, they had all the Democratic candidates for dog catcher and county supervisor and everything, except for Patty Judge. Hillary's poster was there on this float. Everybody but Patty Judge wasn't wanted. DNC didn't care. They catapulted her in on us anyway. A parallel story, my critique of what in America is considered the left, but it's really left centrist. When Trump was elected in 2016, in January of 17, hundreds of thousands of women came. Some of them had their pink stocking caps, and it was a big sister love event in Washington, D.C., saying he's not my president. This was the Sunday before the inauguration, I believe. A year later, they tried to rally the girls again. It didn't work very well. This is a clear-cut example of why when politics are fashion and you go with your pink cap and you march once and you feel good, you've connected with your sisters and say some things, oh, we're against this, and that's it, it's not enough. In the United States, we've enjoyed a very rich past with lots of amazing, interesting things that have happened, and literally rich. Taking a continent from the natives and mining it, the forests, the lakes, the farmland, including my people. A lot of wealth was generated. But why do we have so much private opulence and public poverty? So we educated white people, I'm generalizing, but it seems to be generally true. We like our lifestyles. I'm a poster boy of privilege, despite being a gay guy. So we had the idea since World War II and the New Deal, and before that the Depression, that we could just consume and live our lives and get a college degree and go to, those who were educated and liberal could go to wine and cheese receptions and talk about how horrible the Republicans are and how regressive the church is, and that was it. Some of us donated, some of us marched. Look at that. This is a coincidence, by the way. That's me with my then partner Tim from Ames, Iowa. In Washington, D.C., there's the capital. There's Iowa, by the way. But I'm an exception. I'm not saying I'm special for that in the moral level, but I'm an exception statistically. That all these white people that I've encountered who decry the whole situation, how horrible, they need to do something. Democracy has to come from the ground up and go to the top and shake it. Putin is terrified by public opinion. You go out and lay a flower at Navalny's grave and you get beat up or drug away. The Nazis were horrified by the idea of dissent. The only one successful rebellion against the Nazis were the largely wives and children, adult teenage children of half Jews or whoever they were, who were locked up in a factory in Rosenstrasse. I forget the year, I'm sorry. And they were rounded up, even at their workplace. They were mostly in the war industry forced laborers, to be sent to the east. And their women folk and their teenage children got whiff of this and came down and protested. And they won. They got their non-Aryan, half-Jewish or whatever family back and went home. Dictatorships have the big lie. And the big lie only works as long as people subscribe to it and don't openly question it. And if you do question it. So in a democracy, you have to open your mouth all the time. You don't have to be mean. You don't have to be snarky. It's part of the problem. To be civil, you have to be also kind and tolerant and try to cut people slack. There's no space for all the snarkiness and the meanness and the degrading. The degradation of Kamala Harris from the campaign bully pit, totally shameful. Is this level we've reached? Anyway, we white educated liberals have to stop just talking and do something. Look at the civil rights movement of the late 50s and early 60s. African Americans and white allies who they needed, many of whom were Jews, they marched. They're also Quakers there too, plethora. The big march in Washington was basically single-handedly organized by African American black men, Bayard Rustin. They marched and they were civil and they tried not to cause violence, either violent reactions or commit violence themselves. They were still working the system, determined to change it, but they were active. They'd ride those buses, they'd go on marches, they'd make phone calls. Well, all of us white liberals who think the world is such a horrible place and it could be like this if only we have to work to get it there. I have friends I adore back in Minnesota. I adore them, but they need to do something. Instead of just wringing their hands, talking about how horrible the world is, they need to go out and really do something. So as a former candidate, I saw the treachery of the DNC. I saw the sabotage attempts of the white liberal establishment because they stand to have a lot of ad revenue from the Trump madness. This was like theater. What were there, 13 or 16 candidates at one time? And he was prevailing after one fell. And there were these debates among the Republican candidates. And so this was great theater and great ticket sales. So they didn't want to focus on people's real issues about groundwater and living soil and viable rural communities and keeping young people in Iowa after they graduate from college, providing them with a real future economically. No, they wanted to focus on Trump and the outrageous shenanigans of the most recent hour. I also have to go back a little bit further to the summer of 1984, or maybe it was 85, it's in Turkey Foot somewhere. I was there in St. Paul at McAllister College as a delegate for the forming of the Green Party in America. I'd been in Germany by then a couple times and impressed by the ascending Greens in Germany with the democratic, nonviolent, environmentally minded movement. And I wanted to help others replicate that on American soil. We met, it was at least a long weekend, if not a short week. There were heavyweights. Nina Rothschild was there, her husband, Eric Utney, had the Utney Reader. There were lots of East Coast, West Coast names in the 1960s peace movement, anti-Vietnam War movement. There were a lot of Jews. Some Catholic socialists came, some authors, people in the cultural movement. And we talked a lot, and we came up with proposals and ideas and platform. And then as we began to break up, guess where the whole thing collapsed? We couldn't agree on a name, really. There was a group that wanted the Committee of Correspondence. I also have ancestors who were in that, but that was the American Revolution, almost 200 years earlier. The Green Party at that point stalled over choosing a name everyone could live with. I'm told, I don't know, it wasn't there, but there was the Women's March on Washington after Trump was elected. One of the reasons it wasn't successful a year later and the year after that, there were attempts to try, the diehard, the real committed, because they couldn't agree on the speakers and the platform. And it had a lot to do with identity politics and being more politically correct than the other people. It was infighting over ideology. This is my critique of the left in America. It's not just America. The left collapsed in front of the Nazis. The communists couldn't agree with the socialists. It says a lot, by the way, that a lot of Americans cannot really describe how is a communist different than a socialist. There is a big difference, but we don't know, we don't care. So this is a real problem of the left in many countries. France, Britain, intellectuals, people like me who live in our heads and try to see the world through, understanding it. But I haven't critiqued the right. My grandparents, Elmer and Irma Trams, besides being farmers in Sarasota County for a long time, were bigwig Republicans. They went to Eisenhower's inauguration. We have a little photo of them with Mamie and Ike going by in an open car. I think they'd be devastated and ashamed, mortified over what's going on now with the Republican Party. There are really no words to describe my disbelief at what people believe who voted for Trump, but I have to chew on it. I have to live with these people. I asked like a couple of emails at Thanksgiving time, but got not clear responses. I did get a response, but no answer. It's quite probable, it's very plausible, that of the 15 left, now that mom and dad are gone, my two siblings, who I'll call Lucy and Linus, it fits, but it's pseudonyms, they're partners, their collective 5 children, they're partners, so there are 15 of us. As far as I can tell, 14 of the 15 of us voted for Trump. Childhood friends of mine, Susie, who I love. Susie, if you watch this, I still love you. But a journalist whose husband is the editor of several papers in the Midwest. These are educated people, traveled, experienced, and they voted for Trump. This is a problem. Outside my window, I'm looking at Germany. Maybe you can't see it, but I live in a little medieval town in Thüringen. We had a vote this fall. Every third Thüringer who voted for, basically, the Nazi Party. It's known that Höcke and others at the echelon are Nazis. I have friends. One lives at the end of the street. I really like him a lot. He helps us with our project here. He sends me anti-Ausländer, anti-foreigner stuff. And I say, I don't know what do you say his name? I say, hey, I'm a foreigner. I'm an immigrant. Yeah, but you're a different kind. So if I were an African-American professor from Chicago, rather than being some white boy from Iowa, would I not be as acceptable? So I'm deemed a different kind of foreigner. But I'm a foreigner, and I'm an immigrant. My cousin lives near Berlin. We share the same name. I love him. He's great. No homophobia. No, he travels with his wife, basically retired, all the time. He sends me anti-foreigner, anti-immigrant crap. So we have a problem that people are not thinking. And the right is getting more and more aligned with dictators, with Putin. It's known that Trump is a big fan of Viktor Orban's. Now he's in love with, they call him the madman in Argentina, who on one hand is said to have wrestled classically hyperinflation Argentina's economy down to much lower numbers, like maybe 12% rather than 1,000%. But people are suffering, like much of the population is now living in poverty. But this is a big romance of Trump's with this guy. So all over the world, we have right-wingers. Steve Bannon, dark soul. Once he and Trump apparently had a falling out, he went to Brazil and he coached Jair Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro won. They also plundered the Brazilian coffers. They also sawed down the Amazon faster than haste could make. By the way, footnote, are you paying attention? This past year, the Amazon is half dry. Never happened in human memory. The Amazon's half dry. It's a huge problem. So the right is supporting the far right. Even my educated, lovely friends, my childhood friends, and my family, they're not evil. Some of them are not very well informed, and some of them don't care. Here's an example. Sorry, sis, I love you, but this is happening. This is true. This is a problem. My sister, Lucy, more or less campaigned for Trump informally. I don't know if she campaigned for him formally, but she was certainly buttonholing people in 2016. I went to 4th of July picnic in Iowa at her house with her new husband. She asked what I've been doing, and I've been working with refugees from Syria. And she hissed, are those Muslims? I said, yes, most of them, not all, but they pray the same God as Christians. And she said, no, they don't. I said, well, who do you think they're praying to? It's the same God as Jews, Christians, Muslims who share one Western monotheistic God. No. I said, well, who's their God? I don't know, Buddha or something. So the problem isn't just that voters don't know important things. That can happen. We don't all have the luxury that I've had to study and travel, right? But when they don't care that they don't know, that's the problem. To have strong opinions and to vote based on strong opinions, often emotionally driven opinions, but you don't know, that's a problem. The ascendancy of Trump will affect everyone in the country and many people around the world in so many ways for so long. Every American voter has an obligation to themselves to be informed, to know who they're voting for, really, not just the televised campaign brouhaha. And they have an obligation to the world to the future generations, because probably more than any other people on the planet, we have so much disproportionate power. We have such a large military. We have such destructive bombs. And with that power comes responsibility. We are able to respond and say, oh, well, this happened because, but we're not standing up to it. And when the right, I'm not talking about the far right, they're probably on a fast track to hell anyway, but the people, the little people who vote for the mega rich, people who don't really represent their interest, when they vote for them anyway, there's a problem. Our fellow citizens need to be informed, and we need to talk calmly, neither right nor left, but up front, about our common future. And even the future aside, our common present. We live here together. We can't just vote on a whim or to show the other side, or a protest vote, which happened here in Germany a lot with these people voting for the Nazi Party. The AfD it's called. It was a protest vote. Well, now we have here, and we've had in Saxony, the next province over, no functioning provincial governments. That's a problem. We're not governable. Putin's laughing all the way to the bank or to the bunker. So we are making ourselves vulnerable in so many ways for so long. And we have created this. This did not have to happen. And so I'm here trying to show people how the different pieces fit together to say, we have this problem. Now we all have to solve it. We have to talk to each other civilly, or we'll have civil war. We need to cut each other a bit of slack on both sides. And those of us who are in the center, who can see some truth on both sides, need to say, hey, knock it off, you guys. This is the anchor of our society. The truth is somewhere in the middle, not the ideologues. A closing comment. America has so many things going for it, and has had for centuries. But in modern America, all the things you need cost a lot. Food, housing, education, your funeral, medicine, and old age care. All the things you have to have are organized in such a way that you'll pay through the nose. And you need to be in the system. But the system isn't fair, and it's not kind. And it doesn't have to be this way. Germany, I'm a citizen here too, after 30 years, so I deserve it. I pay taxes. I have great health care. As a doctoral student in Berlin in the 90s, I couldn't have gotten a visa to study without proving first I had health insurance here. Everyone has health insurance. Basically, no one doesn't unless they're slipping out of the system somehow, which is almost impossible to do. No one must live under a bridge. When I go every 3 months to get my meds, my copay is maybe 10, maybe 15 euros a month. That's about $11 to $16. I have great health care. Everyone does. There is private health care available. It costs more. It's doable. Yeah, Germany is the biggest economy still in Europe. Although at the moment we're not doing very well. And it's able to afford this. America has lots of money. All that private opulence, if it were tapped, which means also taxed, Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg and Jeff Bezos, who all are sucking up to Trump now with millions of dollars for inauguration, which is really a big donation. Didn't that used to be illegal, buying power? Anyway, it doesn't have to be this way. My father didn't have to die. Arbitrary decision that my mother had to make during a surgery. It doesn't have to be like that. What's happening in America is the things you have to have, including the news, is a commodity. So they're going to scream at each other. They want you to tune into their station, to Fox, to MSNBC, to CNN. They're going to make it shriller and louder and snarkier and more dramatic. It's like a drama, like a movie, except for it's in real time and has real consequences. So my encouragement to everybody is to disinvest from the marketed news and press that the things we have to have are not usury. Food, education, shelter, healthcare, a funeral, the news. These shouldn't be commodities primarily. Some can make money, I don't care, but not the basics. So good luck. This is the mess we have. Let's keep talking, neither left nor right, but up front, and try to find a way forward together. Because if we don't, none of us are going to make it. Life will not be better. It'll be worse than we can imagine. Welcome back to Dr. Louis Tranz's Trump-era teach-ins. This is the beginning of 2.0 and the rest of the series. In my teach-ins 1.0, 1.2, all the rest, The idea was we've been relatively blessed in the United States. We haven't had real dictators get power in a sustained way over time. We've had some incompetent presidents. We've had some presidents who were totally egotist. We've also had some really good presidents who have served the people. I still maintain that the role of government is to govern, to make sure that things get done, that the system functions, and that more or less the majority of people have a good life and they're content and you carry on. So 2.0 and onward, unfortunately, is more ringing the warning bell and saying, hey, wow. So in the 1.0 series, it was how dictatorships have functioned in other countries, other times, and what could happen now with the Trump administration. I'm hoping I'm not right. It would be okay if I later said, oh, I warned people and said this is what could happen, and look, it didn't unfold quite like that. Or unfortunately, I would say, hey, I told you so. An aside, a little bit of truth in advertising. I have done this before, but we didn't have social media in this sense, to this extreme in 1990, whatever it was, or 2000 something, when we began the second Iraq War. I did send an email out to friends, colleagues, fellow Quakers, my students, former lovers. I sent out to anybody that I could think of and said, hey, we're about to bomb Baghdad. We're going to invade Iraq. We shouldn't do this. No war ever ends the way that one or both combatants think it will. And even those who, quote, win, pay a huge price. And I will say that I wasn't very heated. In fact, some said I was wrong in my warnings. Even a Quaker man who's now deceased, unfortunately, he said, oh, this, I'm not the guy to come back and flaunt, oh, I told you so. And I hope I don't have to come back and say I told you so. But God forbid if my parallel predictions take shape. So whereas 1.0 in this series was about how dictatorships function and what could happen, I want to talk now about specific things. This is not an opinion piece per se. I'm not advocating for the Republicans or the Democrats. This is nonpartisan. I'm doing the best I can to give you historical events in a factual way. I do make mistakes. I try to catch them myself. They're slips of the memory. I'm getting older, 62. Give me a break. The thing that has me filming today, Christmas Eve, December 24th, 2024, is the latest reportings of Trump saying again, and recently repeatedly since being elected by apparently half of the electorate that voted, that Panama should belong to us again. We should take it back. Whatever that means. To take back implies action and doing something as opposed to negotiating a return. And that wouldn't it be lovely to have Greenland? In fact, as I read the article in the New York Times deeper and deeper, there was some reasoning that was sketched out. We need the minerals for, you can fill in the blank, but our cell phones, our solar panels, our electric cars, our weaponry, that's all high-tech almost exclusively now. Even our way to kill people with drones is all high-tech. Not hand-to-hand combat usually on the ground. But also, the article said, the reason is that we have to secure the buffer around the United States against the Chinese, that they would encroach in the Arctic, the Russians. And it was said, although I'm even hesitating to utter the words because it seems so incredible to me that I can't believe it, that we would annex Canada. This has been tried twice as far as I know. I think once during our War for Independence, which we somewhat erroneously call the American Revolution, which, it was a revolution of a system from monarchy to a democracy, but the Confederacy failed, and then we had a federation, and so it was definitely a war for independence. I think one of the attempts was thought about then, and then I think there was some other consideration, maybe it was the 1860s, I don't remember. So the article said there's even been mention of Justin Trudeau's governor, Justin Trudeau. I want to ring the alarm bells on at least two fronts. One is, when we've been expansionists before, it's one thing, when we fought in the Vietnam War, we were sort of taking over from the French, and I don't think the United States really wanted to annex Vietnam. Had we won the war with our South Vietnamese allies, we would have probably established a kind of protectorate or mandate. These are legal terms. Even the UN and the former League of Nations uses these terms. But I don't think we would have annexed Vietnam like we did the Philippines for over 50 years. And you can do your own research in Wikipedia or your favorite source of hopefully reliable information. we killed, the numbers vary, from 100,000 to more. Some say 1/3 Filipinos. I don't know. I do know that we had concentration camps where we concentrated certain segments of the population of the Philippines in the 1890s, early 1900s. People who might become rebels or the families of rebels, and so we could threaten them. Like the English did in South Africa, it's the same. They invented the first concentration camps in the modern era. It was the English, it wasn't the Nazis. Anyway, that's another sidebar. So the Philippines we did annex until it became too costly and awkward to keep it. And so we made military contracts to have our bases there, which we had also for a long time. We've annexed in the past Cuba. Certainly Puerto Rico is an outright annex. So I don't think that the United States was really toying the idea of annexing Vietnam. A lot of, 50,000 American soldiers died there maybe? And how many millions of Vietnamese soldiers? That war to the side, fast forward to today, take back the Panama Canal, although there have been treaties that ceded it to Panamanian control. It's decent. It's reasonable to ask the Panamanian government or whoever is the authority that dictates tariffs and fees for shipping. When Trump says that we're being, pulled over the table, paying excessive fees for using that canal, could be, but you talk about it. You don't just threaten to annex the thing. Same with Greenland. Maybe you could form treaties and agreements, which the EU does all the time. We have agreements in the EU with Turkey and with the Maghreb states, Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco, maybe Libya if you want to consider them that sometimes. So entities can make legal agreements with other entities, and largely those entities usually honor those agreements as long as they also benefit. It's sort of a win-win relationship. There's give and take on both parties. But when you annex something, you don't really think about what the other side will win. So say we annex the Panama Canal. We took Greenland, which in theory has a semi-autonomous government for the 56,000 people who live in Greenland. But if we somehow wrestled away from Danish patronage, are those people who are responsible for those sovereign areas just supposed to say, oh, okay, here, you have it? No. Are there going to be fights? Are we going to bomb? We've already had so many military interventions in Nicaragua and Honduras and in Guatemala and supported Pinochet in Chile and the Dominican Republic and Mexico. It's nothing new for us. So if we blasted our way into Panama, it's only the latest installment of an ongoing story of American intervention in Latin America. But Greenland is a different story because Greenland is under the patronage of Denmark. Not only are there millions of Americans with Danish ancestors, but it's a NATO country and it's in the European Union. What happens if a NATO country, assuming we stay in it, which is not a given, Trump has said, let's leave and let the Russians do what they want. So if a NATO country is at war with another NATO country, are the other NATO countries obliged to step in because we have treaties that if any NATO country is attacked, then all the NATO members respond? Well, it's a bit of a brain fuck because when you have two NATO entities that go at each other, and so there's the next interesting question. So if one is the clear aggressor, do the other countries side with the victim of the aggression? Probably they wouldn't side with the aggressor. In this case, it would be us. So that's a problem legally. There's another problem. I take the man at his word, unlike some of his followers and voters, which I was not. Many people said, oh, well, it's just bravado. This is for the campaign. When this is over, his bark is much worse than his bite. I'm not so sure that's true. At any rate, I take him at his word. So if he really wants to annex Greenland and Panama Canal, that's bad for the world order. Causes all kinds of havoc. But who will do the grabbing? Who will do the annexing? Will it be you? Are you going to go to Greenland and to land and to surround the government complex? I assume they have one, or at least a little shack or something. Are you going to go to Denmark, the streets of Copenhagen, and bomb the Danish capital if they reject U.S. demands that they secede or concede Greenland to our possession? Are you going to go to Panama City? Are you going to be okay when the government sends your nephews or your nieces or your sons or your lovers? You could ask parallel questions about if we were to somehow make some sort of maneuver to take Canada. But let's leave that aside for the moment. Again, a good historian looks for historical parallels and patterns that arise over time. The Third Reich. We know that Putin took the Crimean Peninsula in 2014. He's now making other land grabs. He's taken part of the Republic of Georgia, which, by the way, is where our webmaster lives in Tbilisi. Good work, Dimitri. He's had other land grabs. Putin's had, not Dimitri, not our webmaster, but Putin's had other land grabs in other former Soviet satellites. So dictators need what the Nazis called Lebensraum, room to live in. In other words, for agriculture, for the winning of oil or coal or gas or minerals. China, of course, wants to secure its dominion over Tibet, and I'm sure that it's very covetous of its territory along Mongolia. So dictatorial governments need to keep expanding on some level, either physically to spread out, to stretch out and take in more land, or they need to take resources or people. The Nazis had slave laborers. They made many French and Danes and Ukrainians come to the Third Reich, to Nazi Germany, and to work for the war effort. So when a dictator announces, we need this, Hitler did. His whole politic was about expansion to the east. That's why he went into what we knew as Poland, later occupied Bohemia and Moravia. So all across Europe, the Germans were just devouring country after country, later bringing the Netherlands under its control, Belgium, much of France, later almost all of France, later northern Italy when Mussolini collapsed. So when a dictatorship, which we've been told is probably going to take shape, that's the man's stated objective. This expansionism, which is what the New York Times called this morning, his expansionist objectives, this is frightful. You can divide hairs and talk about political correctness and imperialism. I'm not interested. This is not about revisionism, talking about imperialism or colonialism. No, this is just about dictatorships as a creature, as a dynamic. It needs some materials to feed that inferno. It needs to stretch out. Panama Canal here, Greenland there, if possible Canada, through nuclear blackmail or some other intrigue, or we could claim, as you heard in the first series, as the Nazis did with Poland and France, claimed that Canada invaded Detroit or came across the border into Vermont, and now we have to take the Canadian government because they're a threat to American survival and well-being. This is really a problem. What are you wanting to support now, and how, and by whom? This is really a problem. In a way related to my question, what are you and your family, your friends, your colleagues, what are you willing to do to support this project? Who will you send from your family or circle of friends to go fight or to occupy other people's? Who's going to go then once we succeed in taking Greenland and the Panama Canal? Who's going to go to operate that? Who's going to do the mining, drive the equipment, do the processing, take care of the shipping back to the mother colony? That'd be us, of course. Who's going to carry that all out? Who's going to send out the payment checks to people's salary who are there in our colony? Because that's what it is. It's a colony. Just call it what it is. Who's going to live there and risk being shot by partisans who don't want you in Greenland or in Panama? Because that will happen. That happened to the Nazi regime all the time. There were lots of partisans, Poland, Ukraine, etc. Some people will resist. But the second part of this for me is not just what are you willing to do, but who are you willing to become? Because I know I have German relatives both in Western Germany, near Stuttgart, and Eastern Germany, in the Spreewald, near Berlin, who I love, and their parents, even the ones who said they were anti-Nazi, they were swept up by this machine. They were colluding. And if you don't do something to resist, you are colluding as well. When all of this is over, someday as it will be, someday like Putin and Xi Jinping and Kim Jong-un, Donald Trump will no longer be around. We don't know if he will install successfully Don Jr., God, Eric or Tiffany or maybe Jared Kushner become an honorary Trump, America's first Jewish dictator. It's also a possibility, he might consider it. So when all this is over, two considerations. Many of my fellow Americans consider themselves devout Christians. And many of them, not all, but many of them, I think, as I did, I once wanted to be a Methodist pastor. I wanted to go to seminary and then be sent to refugee camps in Thailand and around the world to be pastor to people, right? My fate turned out to be otherwise. But I know there are Christians who claim that they'll be judged and there'll be a judgment. So even if not in the eyes of the world, in the eyes of your Lord, what will be the verdict of what you have done, or at least supported by your collusion, when bad things were done, when 100,000 Panamanians had to be killed in order to secure American control of the Panama. Do you know Panama City is right there at the west end of the canal? So if you want to have a fight, boom, boom, to take over the canal, you have to also fight, boom, boom, right there in Panama City, which is outside the fence. I've been in the canal and I've seen. So how you live with your conscience, let alone if you believe in an ultimate judger and Lord or not, how will you live with yourself, knowing what you have done? When the Third Reich was collapsing and the Russians were approaching from the east, and we Americans, with some help from the British and maybe some in-exile French, were pressing from the west, often the people in command gave the instruction to burn all the files. They knew they had been doing things that were not right. They'd done them anyway. They knew they were crimes, that Nazi apparatchiks had committed crimes against occupied people, against their own fellow German citizens, against soldiers, crimes of humanity. So people know that it's going well for them for now. Let's just keep this going. But at some point, it doesn't go well any longer. So when all the dust settles and this is stopped, where are you going to be on the side of history? When I was a kid, we played Cowboys and Indians. It was the 60s, 70s, right? But we also played the good guys and the bad guys, and the Germans were always the bad guys, and the Americans were always the good guys. When I was a kid, even though my family was half German-American, both my middle surnames are German surnames, everything German was odious and tainted. Are we Americans going to become that in the future? And it won't be very far future. It'll be soon, like after January, February, March, when these things start taking place. And I'm telling you that we're not even, by the inauguration, it's Christmas Eve 2024, the man has not even been inaugurated. He's already talking about how do we take Panama Canal back, and Greenland and maybe Canada. What's going to happen once he has ultimate power and he's not subject to any punishment? He's immune to any reproach. What things are going to happen? So I'm trying to give you people, and you care to listen, think, some tools to work with. How are you going to respond to this huge thing coming? I predict certain directions. I hope I'm wrong. You're going to have blood in your hands. Most of you, most of us. How are you going to live with that? And what will become of our people? We'll become a pariah, like the Russians are now. I live in Europe. You should have seen how quickly Russian students were no longer welcome to study at the Universität, where I've been teaching. Russian musicians, gone. Russian actors, gone. Russian tourists, gone. What will happen to the Americans? We will be the scorn of the global community. We do need the rest of the world, if you want to be selfish and think about you, to trade with, to sell things to, but also just as friends. Who wants to travel and always know you're a pariah? Think about this, because this is a real thing that could happen and probably would happen. Welcome back to Dr. Louis Tramps's Trump-era teachings. This sitting will be, in some ways, a continuation of the previous one, but going deeper. I think it's very important not to just speak in terms of polemics and hyperbole and what could be. It's important to try as much as possible to go into depth and to try to be more concrete. Here's where I'm coming from. It's no secret that I'm a Quaker. I've been one since I was 17, and I enjoy being a Quaker. I love it. Like anyone of faith, though, sometimes it's healthy to ask, is this really still what I want? Is it serving me, and am I serving it? Answer is always, after some reflection, yes. On Sunday, I was involved with my home meeting, which was in Des Moines, Iowa, by Zoom. That's one of the positive outcomes of the COVID lockdown, is now we can go to Quaker meeting by Zoom. And I actually hosted what's called a second hour program about navigating dictatorship. I want to add a few qualifications here, if you want disclaimers. So I'm living in Germany, in Europe. I've been here 30 years as a resident, and I began touring here when I was 16, so 1980, right? I see what the German media, the European media says about events in the world, Every night we watch the German news, but I also listen to NPR and MPR from St. Paul, Minnesota, where I still have a condo. I read the New York Times, as is no secret, and I also invite other people's opinions and their updates and their points of view. But I'm living in my silo over here inside the Atlantic, and I'm missing some of the discussion over the United States. And so being at Quaker meeting at this presentation on Sunday was very helpful for me because I heard what is moving some of the people there, what they think about, what's important to them. And one of the things that was brought up is the role of young men in the Trump re-election victory. And this is really difficult because I myself have been teaching at universities for some years in the recent past. I have my own observations about, it's difficult to generalize and dangerous, but the current generation, whether it's the young German adults or the young Americans, the young German women, the young German men. But there are some dynamics which seem to be happening all over the Western world, Europe, Australia, New Zealand, you get the idea, Canada, US. It seems here too that the young women are often outperforming the young men. Here as well, it's not just an American phenomenon. I'm a social historian, I'm not, a crystal ball reader or a clairvoyant. But I'm guessing, it seems to me, that as the women's liberation movement of the 60s and 70s left from being just a movement by a few to being mainstream, and now even Republican women, for example, would not be like to be told, you can't vote now. Although there are movements, I'm told, by someone named Teal, that women shouldn't have the right to vote anymore. Wow. But I think for most Republican women, it's a given that their voices are to be heard. So some things that were once on the fringe are now mainstream, by both the left and the right. Even Republicans wear Birkenstocks. And when I was young in the 80s, it was the lefties and those of us who aspired to lead a more environmentally friendly, if you will, green life, right? It's now become mainstream. So it seems that as women progressed and some broke through the glass ceiling and asserted their personhood, their womanhood, that maybe traditional ideas of manhood, of masculinity, changed, morphed, or even collapsed. That's all I can imagine is happening when all these young men report, or it's said about them by others, that they're often adrift. I know one of my sons, he's great, but I also know some of my grandsons, either by proxy or in person. And my sense is they're adrift. In the one case, their mother does the best she can, but revolving partners and revolving men in her life, and so the young boys grow up to think that men are transitory and replaceable and only useful for basically a couple things. And so the one grandson, when he was 16, his highest aspiration in life was to become a video game designer. He wanted to go to Denver. It could be interesting. It could be worthwhile in some ways. It could be even growthful. But I wanted to ask him, I won't say his name, is that the highest thing you can imagine aspiring to? Is that the best utilization of your passions and your abilities, your lifetime, just to create new and new video games? Is there nothing else? The cheeky part of me, the grandfather who's a historian, wants to say, in the 19th century, young men were all full of exploration. They took dog sleds to the North Pole. They mapped the world that was becoming increasingly discovered by Westerners. They built railroads across continents. They did things. We know also the shadow sides. They also oppressed people. We know all that. It's okay. But at least men in Western society had a task. They had an idea to do something, to build or to conquer. It was pretty clear when I was growing up. The sense of manhood was pretty clear. It was also often oppressive as a gay guy, struggling through that, breaking through my own glass ceiling, which is to say, well, gay men are also men, we're not women or strange third sex. But I see and I hear repeatedly that young men are often adrift and lost, not just adrift. So during the Q&A after my presentation on Sunday, some of the people in the group talked about the role of young men and their dissatisfaction, and therefore many of them voting for Trump, who they described, I am told, and I've seen in articles and videos, I do watch YouTube, by the way, oh, Trump is strong, and I heard one man, I'm quoting, he's a real man, he knows what to do, and he sets out to do it. But what if what he wants to do is harmful to people? What if what he wants to do will really harm people, like end up upturning their lives or even extinguishing their lives? And what are these young men willing to do for their leader? Remember, in German, der Führer is the leader. It literally is, Hitler was called the leader. That's, and I think in so many other languages, in Il Duce, in Italian, the leader? I don't know. I think so. So if you have all these young men who are looking for a male role model, especially if that would-be dictator knows this and exploits that, is that why the Hulk came to some of Trump's events and other real men, and he went to podcasts talking with interviewers to talk about real men? To understand, to know, wasn't hawked, but to be tough. Yeah. So when I talked about in the previous take, what will Americans be willing to do to take back the Panama Canal Zone and to take Greenland, or maybe take Canada, it's one thing. But there's a new threat. It's not just how will the world and will history, and for those of you who are Christians, especially born again, but other Christians as well, the Lord judge you, how will the world see you, how will other nationalities see you, but what are some people in our culture willing to become? Murderers, thugs, mass bombers, guards at camps. This is a problem. Again, my favorite template, the case study, the Third Reich. Some young men had no interest in the Nazi project. My cousin Eugen Luig was an artist. He and his friends bicycled in the fall, early winter of 1932 over the Alps, believe it or not, all the way to Jerusalem with a couple freight boats in between. And then after Christmas in Bethlehem, they biked all the way to Cairo and came back through Athens and Rome. And they came back to a new country, the Third Reich. They left the Weimar Republic and they came back to Nazi Germany. He wanted nothing to do with this, but he also got sucked into the Wehrmacht. He was the last person to paint the Frauenkirche in Dresden. So people will get sucked up who don't feel they can resist being sucked up into this big machinery, and there are others who go willingly. We know there were Hamburg police officers who went voluntarily to occupied Poland and, if you will, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, that whole region, and went death squads and were killing how many thousands of Jews per day. It was an industry. They had this system set up with mobile death machines. So what are these drifting young American men willing to do in order to find a sense of belonging, of purpose? And to what degree will the people at the top take advantage of that? The Elon Musk, the Donald Trump's clever marketers, the one who find the interviews with the podcast host, the ones who invite the Hulk to come to future Trump rallies, for whatever that is. This, as I said in the last segment, this idea of expansionism, of bringing Panama back into the fold, and of acquiring Greenland, which was never ours to claim, or our neighbor Canada to usurp it, will require a lot of man and some woman power. What will the young American men do in Panama? And what will they do in Greenland? And what will they do in Canada? I purposely sidestepped that whole topic of usurping Canada. That's a whole thing by itself that needs to be taken apart like in an autopsy, because it's a bad idea, and in a way it's already dead, because it will fail. It's true, they have 10% or so of the United States population. I think their land area is perhaps as big or bigger than our land area. Say we take it. They're just going to be in the streets throwing their caps in the air with B. We're now part of the United States project. People have their own identities. Even within our own culture, the Hispanics fought in the 50s and 60s and 70s for Latin consciousness. African Americans, even though they were Americans, they wanted to assert their humanity, that they weren't there to just be a whipping boy or, to be used and discarded and abused. Women, Native Americans, gay people, one here. What would it be like to occupy Canada? These are things we need to think about now and prevent it. It's this whole project, this video series isn't just to give a warning and that we become reactive and we react with aghast faces. Oh my God, now what's happened? Look. But rather to think in advance and to make very clear now, we're not going to encourage our young adults to support this, to feed this machine. We're going to do all we can to talk to them, to get them to watch videos like this one. We're going to try to love them, but be clear. Something bad is taking shape. it's coming, very likely. It's on its way. As I said in an earlier take, of my family's 15, if you will, immediate members, I was the only one who didn't vote for Trump as far as I can ferret out. How do you get those sort of odds, 14 other people in any group, but in your family group, your religious group, or your workplace, to say, look, people, I'm the minority view, but let's talk and tell me why you are doing this. I'll tell you why I think this. But we need to preempt, or in the future it will be too late. We'll be trying to pick up the pieces. It was one thing with the Nazis and their then latest technology, fighter planes, and they were trying to form the V rocket, which was their answer to a nuclear weapon, and they were going to win the war at the end with a surprise secret weapon, which they never really put into much practice. But at the current levels of technological development, what our bombs today can do, and our dirty bombs, our nuclear weapons, of which Vladimir Putin also has his own store, the damage that is able to be done is inconceivable compared to World War II. World War II would have been a dress rehearsal and a picnic compared to what are 20,000, is it now 30,000 nuclear weapons Putin wants to rearm. He has said he's not going to honor anymore many of the post-Cold War accords. This is the world we're feeling our way blindly into. And if we don't do something as groups, it's going to get only uglier and we won't be able to recover from that. So we need to think about this now. I've been asked again and again recently two things. Why am I launching this series? And who am I to say these things? I've already outlined that for 35 years as a career, I've been studying dictatorships and how they function. But that's not all I've been doing. Something more personal about myself. So when I was 16, I was wanting to go into the ministry as a Methodist. My people were Methodists for many generations. And I quite believed in it. If I was going to be a mainstream Christian today, I'd be back probably to Methodism, although I'd give them hell for this homophobic wing that they have in the church. I was engaged to Beth. Hello, Beth, if you're out there. I know you stalk me sometimes. Hi, if you're watching this. She's a sweet girl and quite clever, too. I was engaged to Beth to be married, and we were also going to farm on the side and have many children. And I was a young Republican, even though I was not old enough to vote, and I campaigned for Ronald Reagan. Yeah, I met the man. I saw Nancy at the Mid-City Airport. It was cold, and he had horrendous red plaid slacks. Even then, it was no. So people do their best, and we accept something as the truth. I used to go to the Perkins where I worked on the weekend after high school class and late at night and witness in the break room against abortion and for Jesus. So I was also born again for a while. People can take in new information, and people, if we're able to shut our mouths and open the ears and our eyes and to look and listen rather than just blather, we're able to see that there are more than one way of seeing the world, and there's more than one truth. But because people are complex, they can be contradictory. It's like having two truths at one time seem to cancel each other out, but they don't. For example, in July of 1979, that's me as a 16-year-old Iowa farm boy with my mom, and on the back with my grandma, Trans, who I loved a lot, and her grandparents, who were Yankees, who took a covered wagon from Iowa in 1851 to Oregon, and he was a sheriff and had a butcher shop. In Grants Pass, there's my dad, and me with one of my horses, and there's me with my calves. So even as a 16-year-old, and all the things I just told you, in this article, I was touting we need to get away from the petroleum age. We need to get away from oil addiction. I was talking about organic agriculture and alternative energy sources. A few years later, when I got to Iowa State, I wrote entire theses. Here's my paper from the summer of 1984 that was published in a series form in the Des Moines Register. The first part, rural Iowa history in a nutshell, an outline. So like how European culture arrived and arose on the prairie. But the second part, suggestions for the future: methane, solar, wind power, revitalize rural communities, cultural centers to offer people something to do if they decide to stay and not move to a cushy job in Texas or Colorado or the Twin Cities. These are things I was already thinking about then. So all of us have in us these conflicting things: the urge, the reflex to be selfish, to think about what we want and now and how to get there. And when we have a moment of wisdom and say, well, actually, I want to go in this direction, but some other people do as well, maybe we could travel together for a while in some ways and reach common goals. And those who would stop us, we need to talk with them, to reason with them, to help them see they have also goals in common that they could reach. Not all, but we can go forward together. Because if we don't all go forward, those of us who are left behind will vote for a fascist, will put on a vest full of dynamite and blow up themselves in a shopping center, or last weekend here in Germany, go into a Christmas market and kill 5 people, including a 9-year-old boy, and injure over 200. And he was an Egyptian-born, Muslim-born resident here, legal resident, who was claimed to be Muslim, anti-Islam. People are complex. So now, in this setting with Trump and all that's going to happen, all of our complexities are going to come forward. And some will be confusing and contradictory. But we have to find a way to deal with those complexities in each other. I'm trying not to be partisan in these series. I also try not to be hyper-religious. I think Jesus is great. I love the man. I want to be a follower of his, a pastor. Later, when I left the Methodist Church, it wasn't because I stopped loving Jesus and the things he did and said. It's because I couldn't stomach some of his alleged friends. This was the time, the late 70s, early 80s, of the big mega churches, and I can't remember them all now, but Oral Roberts and Schuyler and all the ones who seemed on TV to be fake and were just asking people, milking them for their donations. I wanted nothing to do with that, nor with people in church on Sunday who would show up and be smug and hyper-religious, but Monday through Saturday, I would see them in Clear Lake and Mason City, in our little Sarasota County, and I was appalled how they seemed to really be living and thinking and feeling. So if we're going to make any progress, we have to stop the demonizing, and we have to look at ourselves. And for me, one of the most effective, and the option seems the most plausible to have success, is to try to strip down the emotion and the blame, because it's not going to work, and to say, okay, here's where we are. Here's where I think we are. As a historian, this is how it seems to me that we've arrived at this point. Others have other information. Scientists, social workers, teachers. Maybe the teachers and psychologists can tell us why so many kids have autism. Was it now 1 out of every 39? And in 2000 it was 1 out of 150? I don't know the answer to that. Other people will. So if we all bring to the mix our specialties, like the Quakers on Sunday after this presentation, some of them knew some really relevant, interesting things that I didn't know, but by having a conversation, we could expand the realm of possibilities. But the moment that we push back and we want only our way, and we're going to have this certain ideal and think about who we're going to crush in the meanwhile to achieve that, things are not going to go well. So we have to think about who we are as people and become better people. And I'll come back to the fold when self-proclaimed Christians act largely in a way that Jesus would have approved of. That's where we're heading this series. Tomorrow's Christmas. Hopefully I can take a day off, but our job is just beginning for at least the next 4 years. This is not just a one-time rally like the women with the pink stocking caps on the Sunday before Trump's first inauguration. This is going to be a commitment for those who really care and really want to move something, a way of life, a way of awareness, in a way, a spiritual discipline. This is how it's going to change. It's a way of life because it's the only game in town. A career, making lots of money, is not going to mean much if the planet goes to hell, which seems a very plausible possibility. Enjoy your holidays. We'll talk soon. Bye. Welcome back to Dr. Loic Tramps's Trump-era teachings. You might be able to see from the more than usually poor video units that I'm filming this late at night. It's actually the night of Christmas, 2024. I'm tired. My bags under my eyes have bags, and I've got some little thing going on here, even at 62. It's too much chocolate, I guess. But I feel compelled to weigh in while I'm still somewhat lucid and these topics are on my mind. Yet again today, or at least yesterday, again, there's a 7-hour time lap between the United States Midwest time zone and where I live in Germany. It was reported that Trump has again said that, we should possess Greenland. The word he's been using sometimes has been buy, but other times it's just been we need to have, we need to get. And the reason I'm thinking about this, why I'm chewing on it so much, is because as a historian, I know that the last time the United States had an overt expansionist policy and actions was about 1900, during and just after the Spanish-American War, when we, within 10 weeks, routed Spain, what had once been the largest empire on the planet. And we acquired all these pieces of real estate, as they would call it in capitalist terms. We occupied other people's countries. So we haven't had that for 100, 125 or so years. We have had interventions, we've had occupations, but that's a little bit different than actually seizing a country outright. I mean, for a long time, it was as if we did own Haiti. We were there a long time. In some ways, it was like we owned Nicaragua. We occupied it also many times for a long time. But actually take a territory and say, as of this day, this is ours, sort of like Putin did in 2014 with the Crimean. And he would like to do, I assume, with eastern Ukraine. The American men, it was almost all men, it wasn't really women, but the American men who orchestrated our interventions, say 1910 onward, from 1910 to the 50s, this 40-year period, many of them had been teens or youth or even young men. J. Edgar Hoover cut his teeth during World War I on his future career. So a lot of people who later became prominent in American policy had experienced this expansionist period where Teddy Roosevelt and others were usurping land. This is an old tradition in America, manifest destiny. People talked about it was God's will that Anglo-America would expand from the eastern coast of North America to the west coast. Of course, the Russians were in the way. We bought Alaska from them. We bought for a bargain price the Louisiana Purchase from a Napoleon who desperately needed funds to fight the British and others. So we had this idea that it was somehow destiny, our manifest destiny, to rule northern hemisphere of the Americas. Well, we left that alone for a long time. Notice that with this policy, we're actually going backwards, not forwards. We're reviving old paradigms and old goals, not creating really new ones. I'm not hearing lots of good progressive policies about how to deal with, call it whatever you want, climate change, the increase of youth autism. I'm not sure that the decrease in vaccinations will dent that. I think it's probably got deeper cultural origins than it does chemical through a needle. There's so many problems that we need to be dealing with. Funding public things like hospitals, libraries, roads, rebuilding dams. You get the idea. They're really going to spend all this time and attention on expanding our empire or our country. This occupies my mind because, as I've said before in other takes, like with the Third Reich, Hitler never drove a single train to Auschwitz or put a single can of gas in the pipes down into the showers where the waiting Jews were awaiting pending death, whether they knew it or not. He got others to do it. So if Trump wants to somehow miraculously take Panama Canal Zone back and he wants to acquire Greenland, who's going to carry that out? It would take more than just a couple jets scrambling off of some base in Connecticut or Maine or somewhere. It would take more than just a few bombs. It would take a lot more than that. At some point, occupying forces, if the Danes and the European Union behind the Danes put up a fight, it would take a lot of soldiers and a lot of bombs. And are we really going to start bombing our historical allies? So I raise this because this is really a big project. And I know that dictators need projects to focus on and to deflect focus from their domestic policy failures. They've always got this big thing going on with other countries especially. But what also occurs to me is that if we undertake this totally changes the system that the United States has had for a long time, for decades. There were presidents who wanted to make a lot of changes. Ronald Reagan did make changes, but he made it within the system. I didn't have the feeling I was there for all of that. In fact, I once campaigned for the man before I could vote, as I said in other takes. He didn't take over the country. It was more of a matter of him working with Republicans in Congress. I'm sure he had his favorite friends down the road and across the street at the judicial branch of the government. But I didn't have the feeling he was utterly corrupt, and I didn't have the feeling the man was there just to make money, which is not the case currently. So there have been presidents who certainly have had a big agenda. Franklin Delano Roosevelt. You could say that was the last time America really had a large structural change in the government. Republicans, perhaps correctly, they should have been in the opposition. There should always be an opposition party in every democracy, or better yet, several opposition parties to keep the one in power on the up and up and, above board. The Republicans put up a stink, and they're the ones who pushed for term limits because Roosevelt was elected 4 times. Which is unprecedented and hopefully won't happen again. So we haven't had those major changes for a long time. Teddy Roosevelt expanding the country geographically. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, his cousin, not a close relative than that, really finding new purpose for government and reinventing what government can do for people and what people expect government to do. And then Ronald Reagan, who was in a way the reactionism, the counter-revolution to Roosevelt. I mean, at one point, it's quite well known and documented that Ronald Reagan had a New Deal Democrat, as were my paternal grandparents. And you could say my father in a way, who also left a deep impression, just like my mother, who was an ardent Republican, as her parents, the Transes, were Republican county officials in Sarasota County. So what we're looking at is taking a system and really shaking it. And I'm thinking, once again, of the stress. So, you know how art imitates life and vice versa? Today, Chico, my visiting Brazilian boyfriend, and I were watching on Netflix La Palma. We wanted some escapist entertainment. Well, it wasn't that escapist, because I saw some really important themes in that series. People who have knowledge and knowledge about impending disasters or doom or mass destruction, trying to figure out when they can effectively tell wider circles about that, those who have power in government, but also the public, without causing unnecessary panic. I've said before, and I say it again, that I'd be quite happy if all of the worst case scenarios that I'm painting here don't come to fruition. That'd be fine. But like with a potential tsunami or wild forest fires or all kinds of, pandemics or epidemics, those who have an idea, who have a training on likely outcomes of situations should say something. So I'm not trying to be alarmist, but I'm saying this is really dramatic. This is not like other changes of other administrations where you go from Democrat to Republican, Republican to Democrat. Because by and large, the presidents of living memory have worked within the system. But now we seem to have a man who half the electorate apparently elected, who wants to change the system and subvert it. Again, not to be repetitive too much, but picking people to be in charge of departments who don't believe in the mission of those departments and don't believe in those departments. That's one thing. But to actually, let me back up. Remember that film with Schwarzenegger or The Rock? It was called San Andreas, maybe, where California finally had the big one come, and they had to race, was it from Los Angeles to San Francisco? And so the American system collapsed because of external pressures, an earthquake, and then power grids collapse and communication collapse. So that's something from external. But when a system collapses from within and it's dismantled, it doesn't just self-destruct as such or is destroyed from outside, but it's self-dismantled from within. That's a whole new thing. So whether you were in favor of Trump being president again or not, if he does the things which he says he wants to do, this historian can't see any other outcome other than that will cause huge disruptions in systems. The systems will be in large part dismantled, and at some point they don't hold, like a house of cards. And so this is my fret and my warning. I hope I'm wrong, and I don't want to cause undue panic, but I'm not the only one. The other day I watched Bernie Sanders. I've never voted for Bernie Sanders, but I quite admire him. I think he's got some really well thought out perspectives, and too bad the Democratic National Committee edged him out and made him oppositional figure, because a lot of people would have voted for him, I think. He speaks a lot of truth, I think. Whether it's the general truth or not, it's his truth. He's quite straightforward. Sound familiar? He's up front. Anyway, he was striking the alarm bells and saying, people, welcome to oligarchy. We have Elon Musk, who was never elected to a public office, let alone to this office of being co-president. What is happening? This is such a departure from the norm in the United States. This is such a radical restructuring that a lot of things are going to be upended and will never be the same. What are we going to do about that? In the last few days, I've worked with Dimitri, our webmaster in Tbilisi, Republic of Georgia, to finish the first series of videos. And he said, it seems to me sometimes you seem condescending. I said, well, I don't mean to seem condescending, but perhaps I seem condescending when I'm trying to make a point that I had hoped would be general knowledge or awareness. I thought it'd be very clear to every American that those who have lots of money and have the ear of the person in power has a disproportionate amount of influence. So the Trump presidency, the Trump White House, isn't really going to listen to me, even though I do pay taxes. And they may not listen to you, but they're sure as hell going to listen to Elon Musk, who's paid $277 million so far. It's reported. That's actually cheap government. You usually couldn't buy a huge government in that super structure for that bargain basement price. Zuckerberg came and paid $1 million. Bezos came and paid $1 million. So these are all people paying tribute, and puts a whole new spin on pay to play. So what we're seeing is that if you don't pay up, sign a government contract that the Trump corporation profits, if you don't do something to help grease the wheels of this project, you're not going to have a lot of influence. And I would even say that those who are not actively involved and those who actively try to modify or even subvert the Trump administration's project, they will be silenced or at least muted. They might be incapacitated, so they don't have the capacity to cause a problem, whatever form that incapacitating looks like. I can only repeat again, and this is when I might sound like I'm condescending. Take the man for his words. When he says something, believe it. It may not just be bravado. He talked about a lot in his later campaign appearances about enemies of the people. This is exactly what Hitler and the Nazis labeled the Jews, the communists, the internationalists, and vermin. Ungeziefer in German. It's exactly the same idea. So if you're talking about other Americans who don't agree with you being vermin, everyone wants to get rid of rats and mice and other inconvenient rodents, don't they? Squirrels who chew holes in your car cables under your hood. It's vermin. Get rid of them. There's no value. There's only damage. Mosquitoes, snakes, whatever you want. And enemies of the people, which really would be more accurately translated as enemies of the state. And under dictatorship, it means enemies of the dictator. I'm sounding warning bells all over the place, even on Christmas evening when I really want to be asleep. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. This is a different category. Those of you who have children or grandchildren, you would do almost anything conceivable to advance their lot in life, to get them a good education, to help them get a good job. You'd be happy if they found a love of their life that would stick and make themselves all happy. But if you're doing all of that, it's sort of like the quote, I hope I'm more or less quoting it correctly, from Henry David Thoreau, the New England transcendentalist and the writer and the philosopher. What use is it to have a beautiful house without a decent planet to put it on? So you can be focused on your own little circle, your children, your grandchildren, your closest friends, your own fortune, and scurry away on that project. But if there's a larger thing that's loggerheads, all of your work, all of your plans, everything you've built up is just subjugated to this larger thing. And if it's perceived that you're in the way or that you're not in the parade, you won't be able to advance. And you may not even be able to keep your status quo. A lot of people, I hear this from students, they're not interested in politics. I can understand. I'm really tired and critical of the Republican Party, the Democratic Party. They're both syndicates in different ways. I'm skeptical of some other parties as well. I get it that people say, oh, I'm tired of politics. Sure, it's disillusioning. But politics aren't just the people who are elected or get into office somehow. It's the whole thing. It comes from the Greek word polis, the city. Politics is how we move in the city, how we exercise power, how we get power, how we navigate other people and their needs and their wants and their legitimate aspirations. So this is where we get the word politician, policy, politics. Just a fun fact, civil, like civil liberties, civil society, citizen, civics, they're all related to the other Roman equivalent of the city, polis being the Greek. It has to do with how we live in the city. So they don't literally mean just Sparta or Athens or New York or Berlin or Tokyo. They mean the public realm. So how we are going to move in the public realm is going to change when we don't live any longer under a democratic system, where, in theory at least, there are agencies and heads that are supposed to protect you from the state because they're in cahoots with the state and have been subjugated to it. They're subordinate to it. So everything changes. So you may not be interested in politics, but soon, increasingly, politics will be interested in you. What can you deliver to the state? What use can you be to the larger project of the state? It's like living in Soviet Russia, where I was, as I've said before. It's like living in China. It's like living under any... Iran, I haven't meant to leave it off my list, but we could talk a lot about the clique that's run Iran since 1979, when the revolution kicked out the American-supported Shah, who actually imposed his father. So please think about the shock that's to come. This is a full-time job. This is a way of life. We are all going to be thinking about this man and his project and the consequences every day for at least the next 4 years or longer. Some of us made the choice to choose that. Some of us did not. But we will all have to deal with it. And so we all are entitled to an opinion, hopefully one that's informed and thought out and balanced, and hopefully a little bit discompassionate, that we can again talk about events and things that happen rather than our opinions only or primarily what's happening. But here I am on Christmas Day night, red-eyed, wanting to go to bed, thinking there's something larger, like the well-being and the survival of my native country's republic and the way of life that my generation has enjoyed, my parents who grew up in the Depression and witnessed World War II, but still, we've had it good. And I heard a quote once that was very good, that service to others is the rent we pay for a space on earth. So we who've had much, from us, much is expected. So yes, I need to be not the only one with red eyes and bags under my bags, with poor lighting, late at night, leaving a message, a plea to be thinking deeper and doing something all that you can. I read today, either you're assisting or you're resisting. Yeah, there's also something in the middle. There are those who claim they're just decoupled from the whole process. I said before that what you tolerate, you condone. If you don't come out verbally, publicly, or at least in your own inner circles and express a position, then you are indeed supporting the mainstream of what's going on. Whether it's right or left or Catholic or Buddhist or communist or... So where are the people who speak out? I think a lot of people don't know what to do. It seems the Republicans are wringing their hands, doing post-election autopsies of their own programs. That's healthy and it's needed, but it's not going to be enough. We need to all be thinking, how can we work preventatively, not just react to what's going on, but work proactively to inform our lost young men, our nephews, our sons, our neighbors, our students. Hey, don't be bamboozled by this trickster, this man who's promising a lot and might deliver not what you wanted. We need to be active now and verbal. A cautionary tale, I remember too well the Second Iraq War. It was said, I don't know if it's true, but it was said that Quaker meetings noticed someone was coming to meeting who no one knew and who didn't really want to talk to people after meeting. And we had reason to believe that Quaker meetings were being observed by the state. I don't know if that would have been the FBI or who it would have been. But we know that there were professors who self-censored during the Iraq War. We know that the news was basically a lapdog of the White House. Even NPR, which I normally esteem and look forward to, was, for my taste, way too uncritical about the Iraq War, where we waste a lot of our national treasure and countless lives. What about this time? Are we going to do it differently? Are we going to self-censor and live in fear of losing our jobs or some other consequence that's uncomfortable? I think that the more dramatic and urgent the times, the more urgent it will become for us to make dramatic statements and say, I will not be part of this. This is not in my name. I don't want my family involved with this. I don't want my friends, my other communities, if you have one, your faith community, to be involved in this. And I don't want any particular members of those communities affected by what's going on here either. This is the time to start doing that work, not just the 21st of January, the day after, because as is in the beginning of our clip, Trump said, no, just on the first day. All right, good night. I'm going to go to bed. Wow, there's so much to cover. Hi, welcome back to the Trump era teach-ins. There's so much to cover. This is Saturday, January 4th, 2025. I'd like to be able to say Happy New Year, and I do wish that on people, but it doesn't feel somehow really sincere because it's going to take a lot of inner grit to find happiness when the world around is going down crashing. So much is happening even before Donald Trump has been inaugurated the second time for his second administration already now. A lot. And for a historian, at least this historian, and I think I'm pretty typical of modern European, modern American historians, this feels like a very intense time crushed into a small, short space of time. So much is happening behind the scenes, in front of the scenes. What I'm thinking of, especially at the moment, are these recent attacks. One tragic attack in New Orleans, Louisiana, and an almost concurrent attack in Las Vegas. I find these attacks really interesting because the one in New Orleans seems to be the work of a man who was radicalized, a supporter of ISIS, of the Islamic terror group. That's to be expected. We've had that many times. I don't even need to really comment on it. But what's more interesting for me at the moment is the other one by a sergeant from the U.S. Army, 37 years old, Matthew Livelsberger. What I find interesting by his situation is that he actually made pro-Trump statements recently, really approving the political situation as such, and yet blowing up this truck full of explosives in front of a Trump hotel in Las Vegas with notes left everywhere on purpose. This is not a terrorist act. I'm afraid America will collapse. Americans love spectacles, and only then do you get their attention, which may be partly true. Take it as a cautionary tale on my fellow Americans and the world. You can expect more of this to come. I always look at my evergreen case study, the Third Reich. When a people have no legitimate and even safeguarded means of protesting, of opposition, of expressing other views from the mainstream of what's officially accepted, then they find alternative ways to express themselves, whether it's a Luigi Mangione talking about the disaster of healthcare in the United States, or now this Matthew Livelsberger. Politically, the two are probably very different, and yet they both turn to violence to try to make a statement and to chip away at the system. When a system is so calcified and leaves so little chance for ordinary people to make a difference. In the olden days, when I grew up, for example, sorry to sound like an old white guy, we had the belief that if we wanted something to happen, we would write our congresspeople in Des Moines or in Washington. We would really do it. And we had relationships with these people. Even Grandma Luig's cousin, Alvin Miller, sat in the Iowa State House. We had a direct connection to Iowa politics. She was a secretary for him a year or two in Des Moines. So when ordinary people feel they have no other means to make a great statement, to make a difference, they react in a very explosive way. This happened in the Third Reich. There were numerous attacks on Hitler's attempts to take his life. They didn't work out, unfortunately. And these people were mostly right wing or right of center. There were people in the military. It's quite famous that the Stauffenberger clan was a family with aristocratic roots. Erwin Rommel, the African Corps general, these were people, not leftist radicals, they were people wanting to preserve the German state. They weren't necessarily even Democrats, but they had a sense of honor and that they believed in the old Germany, the nationalist, if you will, imperial Germany. And now there was this upstart, this dejected former painter wallpaper hanger from Vienna, from Austria, Hitler. So they turned to violence to try to rid Germany of this plague, the Nazis, the leadership, probably with the conviction that if they could get the leader, then the whole thing would go crumbling. So now we get these attacks of healthcare executives. I suppose the idea that you would send a shockwave through the whole healthcare system, an attack on Trump's hotel, for different reasons, probably attack on innocent partygoers in New Orleans. So my fear is that these attacks will become more common, and they'll claim more and more victims. What we see happening already is what was about a century ago by Yeats. It's very interesting, British poet and writer, William Butler Yeats. He said, "Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosened upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosened, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity." Find that. You can Google it in Wikipedia. Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. In other words, centers like me are less and less heard from, but the people at the extremes, the farther right, the farther left, they're louder and more discordant, and they attract followers because people are desperate for solutions, so they turn to desperate means. Mere anarchy is loosened upon the world. Certainly, all these attacks whether it's Luigi Mangione or now this Matthew Livelsberger. This is anarchy. Instead of going through normal channels of political and social change to throw a bomb. The 19th century European landscape was seen with this. The bomb throwers are anarchist. The Senate could not hold. It was ineffective, rendered ineffective by strong-willed monarchs, and if you have on the other hand the radicals. This is what really got me, though. With a blood-dimmed tide is loosened, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. Is there anybody besides the Amish or someone on a deserted Pacific island that went down a plane crash in 1967? Is anybody left on the planet who's really innocent anymore? Even the Amish, by the way, go to the local libraries. The Amish women check out the Harlequin romances. I know I used to work with librarians across the Midwest. They all said the same thing, so I'm not sure how innocent the Amish are. But seriously, I don't know if anybody has any innocence left. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. And this is my fear. Where are the people who really care? Not that just my friends are among the best, but I really value my friends, and they tend to be educated, traveled people. Most of them, they shake their head and tisk what a state the world has fallen into, but I don't see them really doing much. They are actually not out there fighting the battles. I don't hear from them any strategies, any plans to be involved, to try to counteract what's going on. And so this poem is really prophetic a century later. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. And this is my fear, is the people with the loudest voices at the moment, currently the ones who command the most stage, to get the most attention. Of course, that's inevitable when you have all these social commentators from Fox News and you pack them into your cabinet. You're going to get a lot of megaphone through just these people alone. So my fear is that people who don't have the best of intentions, they have the most audience. They have the loudest speakers. And I come back to Elon Musk. I have, in principle, nothing for or against the man, but again, I'm making observations. So when I saw him this fall, he was throwing up his hands and showing his belly at Trump's rallies. And I asked a friend, why would he do that? He's actually educated, in some ways, in many ways, seen by the world, a successful man. He said, he wanted to form an X. Well, maybe that could be. All I saw was the big belly and thought, this is the most profound, moving thing you could do, Elon, is go onto stage, you non-American born immigrant. The best you can do is come, because you can't run for office, even if you wanted to, as president anyway. All you can do is come and jump in the air. This is the best we can expect. So I don't know his motives. I suspect he'll get lots of tax breaks. He'll save lots of money under the new regime. And of course, the other people who've come and who have brown-nosed Trump, Mark Zuckerberg and Jeff Bezos and all the rest who came and gave $1 million or more, even international companies are now giving Trump money. It's been reported today that Trump has taken over $200 million since he was elected. He's not running for office anymore, is he? He's on the verge of making more money now as a re-elected president than he did as a presidential candidate. Strange. So my fear is all these people who have the biggest megaphone are among the worst. What does it mean, worst? It means that they are self-focused and they're there only to enrich themselves, to line their own pockets, and to plunder the public coffers. The fewer watchdogs you have in government, the fewer people you have monitoring where the money's going, the more you can plunder, whether it's to put dirty water in the environment from your factory or to cheat on the air emissions on the cars you manufacture or whatever. You dismantle the state, you can do lots of bad things. I just celebrated my 62nd birthday in Berlin with my Brazilian boyfriend, Chico. I sent him a link to a film today. If you go to YouTube and enter George Stevens, you'll come up with a film. It's been recently colorized of Germany in April, May, June, July 1945. And I said this to Chico because we had actually just been at Brandenburger Gate, in German Brandenburger Tor. We'd been in Munich at the Marienplatz, at the town hall square with the Glockenspiel, yes, well, Brazilian tourist. And I wrote to Chico and said, we were just in many of these places. We were in the Alps overnight, had a great little time out, Oberammergau, not far from Hitler's eagle's nest, Adlershof, in the mountains near Garmisch-Partenkirche. So I sent this to him and said, look at this. These are scenes of Germany at the end of the war in places that we were, and now with this colorization, it brings all these people back to life. And you see the desperation and the misery. You see Russian troops meeting American troops at Torgau, which is where the Elbe goes through and the two forces met, exchanged cigarettes and whiskey and women and photos. It's all in the little film. You see in this film the German refugees fleeing the east, where the Soviet army had come and occupied. You see it all. You see people pushing the few possessions they still own on little carts, either into Berlin or out of Berlin. You see the desperation. And Chico wrote back, it was interesting, of all the things he could have said, he wrote back just 2 sentences. How did a country come to this? It's also lamentable. And it really was very sad. Millions of people died. Millions of people were hurt. Tens of millions were uprooted. And not to mention the soldiers killed. These are just civilians I'm talking about. And the Jews who were murdered viciously, cold-bloodedly, okay, in industrial murder machine, almost like assembly lines, you know. So the answer has to be to this unexpected question, how did a country reach this state? I mean, just to see Germany laying on its back, knocked on its ass, how did that happen? It didn't just happen in May 1945. It didn't happen in April 1945. It happened in 1939 when the Germans invaded Poland, and 1940 when they then turned to the west and invaded France. But it happened even before that. It happened when Hitler saw to the Reichstag burned. In 1936, when the world didn't mostly boycott the 36 Olympics, they went to Munich and they basically legitimized the Nazi regime by being there. But it happened even before Hitler took power. As I said in my other segments, he actually tried to putsch, a coup in November 1923. 10 years before he actually legitimately took power through this election, he was actually trying to take it by force, which was a fool's treasure hunt because he had no chance in hell. But you have to look at the collapse of Germany in 1945, even before 1933, in the 20s, the Weimar Republic. And an astute historian, or junior detectives like you people out there who are not historians, think about Germany World War I, when the moderates and the left could not maintain much influence, and the Kaiser, the emperor, and the Junker class, the aristocratic class, they were basically all gung-ho to launch this war with Austria and later Italy against the other countries, Britain, France, Russia. So the seeds of the future have been planted in the past, and my real fear of the United States at the moment, I predict that at some point this whole charade will come to a crushing down. And when the current farce comes crashing down, it won't do so peacefully and quietly because there won't be a real opposition to step in at this point. There won't be an obvious plan B. I mean, by dismantling the current American system and imposing something new, by definition, the old system's no longer legitimate unless you can quickly reassemble, which after so much bloodletting, you can't really just recreate something, you can't revive the corpse, right? So my fear is that when all this pans out, when all the plundering's taken place and all the in-house fighting between the different factions of commerce versus media versus science versus the health care industry versus the military complex versus the Republicans, even those few still believe all this, and it's not just a ticket to plunder. When all that's fed itself out like a fire, it burns itself out, what will be there to step in? And my greatest fear is, yes, we have the chance, we could somehow find a People's Congress where we set up a better system, one that's not just two parties, but rather there are many parties. We could even get rid of the horrible Electoral College, which is a remnant of slavery. It's really true. Okay, the compromises between the North and South about counting heads, counting voters, okay? So we can get rid of that and get rid of non-contiguous gerrymandering. The political districts should be kept contiguous and not with all these tentacles going out and goosenecks and feet hanging down like the famous Political Mash cartoon about gerrymandering. We can start a new government where the Supreme Court justices don't have life appointments. Crucial, especially when 2/3 of them at the moment are more or less in Trump's pocket. So there's the idea, the hope, as has happened after every debacle, after the Nazi debacle in the West, the Western Germans tried to start a new system. Eastern Germans were swayed by the Soviet occupiers who then shepherded them in a certain way. But after every collapse, we're looking at Syria and the vying for power. My fear is, yes, maybe we could, in the best case scenario, reinvent the American governmental system and improve it. If we can't do that, then who will be in charge and how will people live and who will have influence? I am a former pastor candidate. I really wanted to go into the ministry. And I don't want to moralize now or be preachy, but at this stage of my life and this point in my thinking about the current situation, I come back to some of my Sunday school lessons. Spoiler, my mother was a Sunday school teacher down the hall. I never had her. She was a Sunday school teacher for years in the Methodist Church in Clear Lake. I've talked before about, morality is really debatable. What is a moral thing? What is not? So let's leave that aside because I can't judge and probably you can't either. But we can talk about those ethics, like how do we live together and what's a successful way to live together and what's a way to live together that doesn't work. I would say that the way that doesn't work long term is to blast your way into a scenery with guns or bombs, i.e. the current terrorists who are doing all this. It doesn't really have a long-term impact that's positive, does it? That's no way to live together. For a while, it might be exciting and it might get people's attention, but it's no way to enact long-term sustainable change. So I would say that in order to live together ethically and successfully, our system has to be based on a model meant to ensure the most well-being for the most people possible. This current system was created in the late 1700s, early 1800s through the amendments then into the 20th century, of course. In large part, the Founding Fathers, there were hardly any mothers, so not being as sexist as some might think. But they wanted to assure that some tyrant couldn't come to power, so there were checks and balances. But in the current situation where the Republicans now have the White House, both houses of Congress, and the Supreme Court, and all these rich oligarchs who are rising, who want influence. Elon Musk is only the most visible, but perhaps even more dangerous are the ones who are invisible behind the scenes, whispering into Trump's ear and his cohorts' ears. That's the most dangerous, the things we can't see. And the system was meant to keep these people in check, because there will always be people who want power for themselves, for their own glory, for their enrichment. And there'll be people who are mentally ill, people who blow up trucks, people who mow through public gatherings. And civilized people have systems in place to mostly prevent those people coming to the fore. The breakdown of the system is when the system's changed or ignored or trampled over, and these people prevail. This is our greatest fear at the moment, is that people with bad intentions, read self-interested intentions, will prevail. And how long will it take for people with higher intentions, with more socially minded, not self-minded intentions, that they might get power back and codify it to keep these people out of power, or at least to hobble with the damage they can do. Let's hope. Welcome back to Dr. Loic Tranz's Trump-era teachings. It's Sunday, January 5th, 2025. I've begun to give a date to these installments because so much is happening so soon, as I said yesterday, even before Donald Trump is inaugurated to a second term, that I want you viewers to have some sort of anchor in time, this progression, this evolution. This is all sort of an art, not a science. I'm not really a professional video maker, as you can tell, although I did get you more light today. It's snowing outside, so there's a lot of light coming off the back courtyard. After yesterday's recording, I thought about what had I said, what had I not said, and I realized I wanted to add a few more comments. And I'm trying not to repeat too much material from earlier recordings, but I don't know who's watching which segments. So sometimes I feel I have to really fill people in who might be coming new to this. What I want to say is that I try to keep my opinions at a minimum. I try as a social historian to talk about historical events and my best understanding of them based on 35 years of studying dictatorship actively at the master's level at Goddard College in Vermont, then at the PhD level at Humboldt-Universität in Berlin. So this is what I've been doing my whole work life, and this is what I'm glad to share. But now I've been watching things develop the last decades, and we're coming to a point where I'm just striking the alarm bell and saying, hey, I know that if I just give you opinions or a lot of vitriol and snarkiness, that's what a lot of people are already doing. And it won't make the situation better, will it? So I'm trying to coolly step back from some of the raw emotion to present other patterns, other dictatorships that have happened throughout history. I realized recently, by the way, I under-comment about Nicolas Maduro's dictatorship in Venezuela. Sorry, it's not on purpose. And I also have said too little about the Daniel Ortega dictatorship in Nicaragua. I was in Nicaragua with the American Lutheran Church in the summer of 1984, and I was never communist, but I was sympathetic to the revolution. It went really awry, and it's important to own things and to see this evolution over time. Yesterday I talked about the evolution of the United States in a parallel citing a video that's been colorized of George Stevens moving pictures of Germany at the end of World War II. And my Brazilian boyfriend was very clever, also interested in history, said, how could a country end up in this state? It's really lamentable, he wrote in WhatsApp. And it occurred to me, he has this really right. Similarly, you could trail the American evolution the last, basically since 1980, when I was a young man. And again, I campaigned for Ronald Reagan before I could even vote. Later, I realized that he was an actor, literally, and very good at presenting a certain worldview that necessarily didn't exist, or not even his. He'd been an ardent New Deal Democrat, after all, in the 30s and 40s. So watching as a person alive and cognizant and studying and learning from the 1980s onward, this is where we're at now, 45 years later. Just briefly, Ronald Reagan said basically there was nothing more important than the market having free reign. He talked about trickle-down wealth, that when the wealthy had more money, that would go down eventually to the workers and the underclass. His friend and admirer, Margaret Thatcher, said there's no such thing as society. She was, by the way, I think, a chemist, and she wasn't a humanist. Reagan's own, I think, Department of Agriculture head, or maybe he was in a different department, David Stockman, the son of dairy farmers from Michigan, said that a family farm is only a sociological concept. My own family lost our farm in 1985, as a third of all Iowa farmers did in that period. And it wasn't through lack of working or ignorance. It was through many things beyond our control, boycotts of the Soviets, et cetera, et cetera. That's not the topic at the moment. So I've watched how all this dominant theory about there is no society and things like a family farm is just a sociological concept, it's not really real, production should be based to maximize efficiency, to hell with any social consequences. So now we have this where the rich can plunder the rest of the culture, and now I would say, like in so many years, so many times in the past, in the 18th century, during the Gilded period, you can keep going backwards. Whenever the rich get the upper hand without any counterweight to control them and keep them in check, their whole interest is self-interest. And that's what I said yesterday as well, that I would say a beneficial attitude for the culture, for the collective, is what's good for the most people. A harmful, you could say a bad ethic, a bad motive, is what's for me. The rest of you go to hell, which is basically what the rich say. People like Elon Musk and our friend Jeff Bezos and all the rest. So right now it's hyper-capitalism, hyper-plunderai. So the more the rich can disassemble a state, the more access they have to all the collective wealth we've built over generations, over decades, all the road building, all the factory building, all the markets established, all the banking institutions that make all this possible, take off all regulation, and the fox is running the chicken coop. So what I want to come back to today is to build on this. I talked about ethics as opposed to moral. Morality is really something we can hardly really debate because it's so individual, so subjective to each person. However, ethics is a bit different. At least here in Germany, where they used to teach religion classes, they're now replacing that with ethics classes, talking to young people in state schools, how can we live better together by thoughtful ethics, by social justice, to try to keep the whole system going out of whack, off the rails, which happened under the Nazis, which happened under the communists who came to power in Eastern Germany after the Nazis. It doesn't matter, dictatorship of the right, dictatorship of the left, but anytime the state goes off the rails and the ordinary people, the middle class, the working people, the lower classes, when they lose all control or influence, then things go out of control. And I think this is where we're at now. So I would say that we need to slow down and think about when this is all over. And I believe, this is a personal opinion, that it will not last because it's not sustainable. As a Quaker, I believe that there's darkness and light, and that in the end, the light triumphs. But it doesn't mean there isn't darkness for a while. And these are dark times. So when all of this discombobulates, it's not sustainable. It's not built on love or solidarity or how can we build something better together. You don't even have to be moralistic or even ethical, just practical. How can we work together to get the roads paved, the hospitals functioning, the libraries well-stocked, whether it's books or electronic media? How can we work together to do more than I could do by myself or you can do by yourself? When the rich take over, those questions become secondary, tertiary, way down the list. So out of self-interest, I asked my other middle-class centrist people and working folks who are thinking, and the underclass who wake up from this Trump Kool-Aid and realize, oh, he's not really working for our benefit, but his own and from his supporters. How can we pull this back? It's going to be dark. It's going to be rough. And this is what I wanted to say I didn't get to yesterday. We need to talk mental health. Morality aside, ethics aside, pragmaticism here, but also just mental health, where there's so much that's not being shared. There's so much happening behind the scenes, so much that most of us aren't privy to. There's a dissonance. It's like the Third Reich, like the Soviet Union, like Kim Jong-un's North Korea presently, like Vladimir Putin's Russia presently, like too much MSNBC and too much Fox News. When you have people saying what the reality is, and it doesn't really reflect what's happening on the ground, then people live on the ground, people live their lives, and they see there's one truth going on, like all the homeless people on the West Coast in the big cities, or all the ordinary people who are working but can't afford decent grocery bills because they're too expensive. Housing is almost unavailable. I just spent 40 days in Ireland, September, October, November, early December. Middle-class Irish people can't easily find housing. I explained that in another segment. Go backwards. So when all this stress is happening, all this dissonance, people aren't sure what to believe. And I said this in my very first segments, that lack of information and lack of clarity makes stress. When people get stressed, our levels of mental health decline. Mine, yours, anybody else's, especially those of us who don't have social contacts, who don't have stable relationships, who aren't anchored in a group or friends we can call on the phone and talk. So it seems that mental health for many people is actually shrinking. We look at Matthew Livelsberger, we look at the man who ran the truck into the crowd in New Orleans over New Year's Eve. We look at the Egyptian Arab who emigrated to Germany and decried Islam and drove the truck into the crowd in Magdeburg in Germany a couple of weeks ago. So all these people, you could say, were mentally ill. But where did the illness come from? You have a middle-class professional psychologist, or maybe it was a psychiatrist. You have a sergeant in the army who's 37. Luigi Mangione, young and promising, goes off to Asia, comes back for a period of contemplation and reflection. So you get all these people who could be out in the street right now, could be your nephew, could be your spouse, could be... So they're becoming unhinged. And if you want to take that aside and say, well, maybe they're mentally ill, they're just radicalized. Okay, fair enough. What's happened to them? Why don't they think they can join forces with some peace group or some consumers protection group or some taxpayers relief union? Probably because they've concluded that those things don't really work. So we have all these people who are unhinged, not part of the greater good, not part of the greater movements, and they're becoming violent. And I guess you could say that they have concluded that the only way to change anything, or at least to get attention, is to go out in a big flurry of flames. This is a problem. So I've said in other segments my concerns about young men. I would also add here my comments about my students. I've liked most of my students, but I'm concerned. I have the feeling that even middle-class young people getting educations at the university level, a lot of them, they have really severe mental problems, emotional problems. I'm told by both American and German colleagues of mine, friends of mine, most recently, just before New Year's in Nuremberg, the man that we stayed with, a teacher in gymnasium since 2007, they report that they're noticing a change in the young people. We like our young people. I have nothing against them. But we're concerned because we who are older, who know a different era, can say, this isn't the way it was. It's not the way it has to be. The one example I may have talked about, but I'll give it again now if I didn't earlier, was that my host in Nuremberg said the same exams he used to give in 2007. He's kept all of his exams. He's very German. Hope you're not watching this and feel offended. But he's kept all of his exams. He can't give the same exams because the current crop of pupils in the gymnasium, which is the higher level, there's the, in different German states it's called different things, Realschule or technical school or whatever, but there's two levels in German public education at the young adult level, and the creme of the creme can't pass the exams that their older siblings or older cousins or even their parents could have passed. They can't. That's a problem. It's about the competency in the future, Who will run the culture and keep it going? Who will keep it at a high level of quality? The water pure in our taps, the lights on, our factories humming. But beyond that, who's going to keep the culture going on an ethical basis? If they don't feel connected, they don't feel invested in what's going on around them, how many more of them are going to discombobulate and march off the rails and seek to make their splash? I have the opinion that many of these mass killers who go into malls and to churches and other public areas, and they take a lot of victims in themselves, or if they survive the attack, they expect to be shot by the police. It's a suicide more than anything else. These people are desperate. How can we avoid that? How can we preempt more of that happening all the time? I think that when you have a dictatorship where people can't freely be involved in the system and have influence, that's going to increase. And that's my concern. Welcome back to Dr. Lee Tram's Trump Era Teach-Ins. This is the 9th of January, 2025. So last night at dinner, watching the German news, reporting about the fires in Los Angeles, I cried. When was the last time that you cried about our nation? And I can tell you more or less what the lamentation was about. How ironic that the day that Jimmy Carter, former president of the United States, should be eulogized and memorialized in Washington, these fires were burning. I remember quite well my youth. You might remember yours. I remember Jimmy Carter being president. Another time we'll talk about my stance on it then. I was a kid, but I had opinions about it. My father thought that Jimmy Carter was part of the Trial Commission, therefore untouchable, But now in retrospect, this is what historians do. At any given moment in our lives, we see our journeys a certain way. Only later, as we age, I can speak from experience, we see things differently. We have new information, we mature, we see a wider picture, but at any given moment, things are really subjective, sometimes heated. For example, following the fires, I noticed that there are lots of different perspectives, people with accusations, people with suspicions. I looked at the Daily Telegraph, which, by the way, when I was in school in North Yorkshire in the 80s, we called it the Daily Telegraph. It wasn't my first paper to go to then. We all evolve, we all change and grow, hopefully, otherwise we don't survive. The Daily Telegraph now has an impressive online presence, which it didn't have, obviously, in the 1980s. But looking at the Daily Telegraph's feed about the Los Angeles fires, it's interesting. At 8:33, I'm not sure whether it's Los Angeles time or London time or German time, but at 8:33, it reported there are no really credible cases of arson in the Los Angeles fires. An hour and 3 minutes later, it was reporting about citizens who'd made a popular arrest of a man later reported to be in his 30s and homeless, and there's videos of him being taken away by the police. And indeed, it seems that he might have been involved in the Canada fire. What this says to me is a historian's job later is to come back with new information and alter the earlier reports. Same in one's life. So you can be your own historian, later coming back to your own experience and saying, hey, this is something I now see differently. The reason I bring this up is I cried for my nation. Because in decades past, in the 70s, 80s, the 90s, even the early aughts of this century, something like what's been happening the last few days in Los Angeles would have been a horror scenario, would have been a science fiction, would have been something that wasn't very likely, supposedly. And now it's happening. We can discuss, we can debate the role that climate change may, probably, or not play in this scenario, but let's suffice to say, for my purposes at the moment, the unthinkable has now become reality. Is what we're living through. And how ironic that we take one of the great, I would say, humanitarian presidents, especially the man after he left the White House, who was involved with many objectively beneficial things, Habitat for Humanity and peace accords around the world, and being part of global observation of elections that were seen as questionable in certain countries. He did a lot of things that people, I think, generally would say were humanitarian. So he's being buried, even as we're about to have the second inauguration of a man who's very controversial and I would say has done a lot of things that are very questionable. Along democratic terms, not the Democratic Party obviously, but in a country with a system self-alleged as democratic, doing things that are not in accord with that country's system. So ironic, it's almost as if the nation's burning down. And I cried for my country thinking, what is coming? Yeah, whoa. As a historian, and as a self-tagged centrist, there are things happening that I can just say, wow, and maybe some of you too. History will tell in the future what comes of these things. We'll read the tea leaves later, going backwards, not forward. But at the moment, wow, apocalypto. What I'm sad about is watching how others have treated this news of the fire and of the secondary presidency of Donald Trump. Watching Fox News takes, literally Fox News commentators and reporters reporting this, talking just recently about Greenland, and some female reporter there, a commentator, saying, well, this could be an interesting thing. Why have we lost the perspective that any time you take territory from another sovereign set of people, it's not okay? It's like what Putin did with the Crimea, 2014. Generally in the West, we said this wasn't okay, it was a crime. Why do we have anyone in the United States saying if the United States were to take Greenland by force, or the Panama Canal Zone, or Canada, this is not okay? Why do we have anybody of any political stripe legitimizing this, legitimizing fire and politicizing fire? Gavin Newsom isn't my favorite politician for lots of reasons. I've been to California numerous times. If it were really my place to live, I'd be living there now, not in Germany, right? So even though he's not my politician and California isn't my first place to live, I have great empathy for those people. The scale of their loss, their collective loss, and individual losses of homes, of everything they've built up, but especially their photos, their mementos, the physical manifestations of things they've experienced and worked on, and their unique contributions to the wider pool. So this would be the first thing I would comment on if I were a public figure, which I'm not. Trump, unfortunately, goes after Gavin Newsom and makes it a political event. Why can't we just have, for the time being, as the tragedy is unfolding, messages of empathy, of sympathy, of concern? Why do we have to make all this political, both from the re-elected president and from the news agency, which is his sounding board? Why? Why can't we see this as humans? Maybe we should all be crying for things we're losing in our country, in our culture, in the world. But is this really the moment to make political hay? I would hope not. It seems, though, some don't see it that way. Something that interests me at the moment, which intersects with the fires in Los Angeles and democracy, at the first glance you think that doesn't fit together at all, it's mental health. Kate Woodson, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist for the Washington Post, and obviously wizard of social media because I've been following her and quite impressed by things she does. For example, she drawn attention that the attacks in Las Vegas and New Orleans recently were both by military people. Interesting. She calls it a wake-up call. Could be that. Anyway, what intrigues me about this is I think she's right. Yesterday, I reported about some homeless man who seems to be Hispanic who was wrestled to the ground by citizens in the area where he was caught, reportedly setting a fire. It was said that he was homeless and had mental health issues. Kate Woodson, who should speak for herself, and not me, but what I gathered from her, is talking about how can a democracy be healthy if many people within that community, within that society, are not healthy. I've reported before about some of my students' actions that I'm worried about the young people for lots of reasons. You're worried about young men, both in the United States and in Europe, where they seem to be drifting to as a group and underperforming. We know that there's a lot of mental illness out there. When a person breaks a leg, he or she goes to the doctor and has it looked at, x-rayed, set in a cast. But when we have mental issues, many of us are more reticent to go to someone with training and say, hey, I'm not doing well in this regard. Can we talk about it? Do you have any resources to help me? So mental illness is still too much a taboo for many people, but it seeps out anyway if you don't address the thing that's motivating the person, that's plaguing the person. If it's not addressed consciously and directly, it goes awry. As I've aged, I've become more, I don't want to say tolerant, more empathetic. It's horrible that anyone would set a fire. It's unspeakable. I'd be really angry if I were on the far right. I'd say, guillotine. But I've yet to meet a baby that came out of the womb and say, oh, that baby's got mental problems. I would say in most cases, mental health issues are not so much inherited or born, but are acquired. I don't know what happened to that person. I know I've seen some immigrants here in Germany who I can only imagine, have had a hard time adjusting. Also, young African men who can't get a job as readily as, say, a Ukrainian refugee or a Syrian refugee. Skin color issues going on there, I assume. Some of them wig out. I've seen them walk down streets in France, in Germany, elsewhere, showing asocial and disturbed behavior. So I don't know what happens in other people's process. I only know that mental health is a problem. And if you have a government, a system based on the people, on the populace, and a large percentage of the populace has mental health issues, the culture has mental health issues. Fast forward to a related topic, but a little bit different. In 2014, Matthew McConaughey played the role of Joseph Cooper, a farmer and former astronaut, in a film where he was then selected to take a spaceship to find another planet because this one was uninhabitable. I remember the opening scenes. I was very impressed. Again, I'm from a farm in Iowa, right? So he and his family, as I remember, this has been 10 years ago, 11. There's a dust storm coming up, again, another one, and they're rushing about trying to get ready for it. But the area around them looks scorched, dried out, desolate, literally made into a desert. There's a scene where he or someone in his family goes to the local school. The school is running not even half-mast. It's open, it's running, but everything is decrepit and dusty and malfunctioning. What made me think of this is that when COVID broke out, a lot of people said, oh, I can't wait for this to be over. Especially when we had lockdown. Oh, I can't wait for this lockdown to be over. And I said then, you can go into the internet and find my old videos comparable to this series. I said, people, this is not going to be over next week or next month. And even when it is over, when lockdown is relaxed or even abolished, so many things will have changed. Well, same thing with this fire in Los Angeles. People are already talking about it, and good for them. They want to find a positive spin, a happy face. Oh, we're going to rebuild immediately. President Biden, who's still there, I think we're going to miss him when he's gone in many ways, saying, oh, the government will help pay for people's direct cost in trying to rebuild their lives. That's all inspiring and laudable, but you've got by now 20,000 structures that have been destroyed or damaged. How are you going to rebuild all those houses? First of all, who's going to clean it all up? Where are you going to take the refuse? You can't just dump it in the ocean. So there's this huge project to blade off all of these thousands of acres or hectares, clear the land, rebuild, not balloon-built wood houses with tar paper and paneling and things that burn. You'd have to build those houses with concrete, like in Southern Europe, stone. It's very expensive. And you're going to do that for tens of thousands of lots? If this is where we're at now, won't these fires become more frequent? Isn't it plausible to become more ferocious? You have a scene like out of Interstellar, the film I just alluded to. So I don't want to be a scaremonger, but oftentimes people who read the tea leaves and tell what they see, what they deem as the truth, are labeled as scaremongers. But we're just saying, hey, we're looking around, we're observing, and this is what we're seeing, and we want to know, anybody else seeing this as well? Anybody else afraid that it could go down this path? I am, because you can try to rebuild LA if it's even feasible. But if you do, what will it look like? And is it for naught if these fires come again? Even if you have stone or concrete houses, they also burn. In every house project, you have to have some flammable material, wood or other things you have to. Floors, furnishings, the whole kit and the caboodle. So if these fires come back with a vengeance and they breathe in those canyons, from the inland to the sea, they're like hairdryer. So there are all these considerations, and they're so diverse from how are we with each other, how are we with ourselves, how do we keep our mental health in check and in balance. These are stressful times, not just global warming, or if you're on the right, call it climate change, whatever you want to do to make it palatable for yourself, but also the events that are happening. Wars, Middle East, Ukraine, Russia, street violence, random violence in the New York subway system, shootings. There are all these things that stress us. When I was a kid, we didn't have all this. People had other problems. So how do we keep our mental health functional? How do we build empathy, for example, to say, wow, tens of thousands of people have just lost their homes. It's time to feel with them, to offer them support, tangible and moral, emotional. It's not the time to make political hay, to blame governors or mayors. Later, Even the mayor said, was it yesterday or the day before, this question about her responses and her competency have been asked. She's responded to them, and she won't respond to them again until later. That's what we're dealing with, is emergency management. So I would like to ask that everyone massage their humanity, find their soft jelly parts inside, and keep them warm and malleable, and that we shouldn't be striking at each other with snarkiness and malice and calculating for political or monetary gain. This is not the time, because we're all in this together. If you need, call it up maybe in the internet, Interstellar from 2014, Matthew McConaughey and others. Is that the future? I'm afraid so. And if it is, all of us who are alive then will be there. I plan to be among that group for a while. How are we going to deal with this? We're all in this together. Slaughter each other now, publicly, social media, in the halls of Congress or other places of government. It's not really going to help us. We need to tamp it down. And by the way, 2 more comments. I Googled yesterday the fairness doctrine from the 1940s. It was in effect about 40 years. When I grew up, media, that meant television, radio, had an obligation to provide opposing views on things. It was when that was relaxed, ignored, later abolished, 2011 I think completely abolished, something changed. You have things like Fox News arising that didn't have any mandate anymore to have to supply people with opposing viewpoints. They just gave theirs, and so the news became actually views and became infotainment. We didn't have that. Obviously, the 3 major networks that existed when I was a kid, they cared about ratings, but the news was the news. Walter Cronkite and so many other pioneers of early broadcasting, media broadcasting, they would roll over seeing what today is sold as news in the United States. In other places it's somewhat better, other places worse. So we need to have, again, this fairness doctrine, I think, that media outlets, they're a utility, like a telephone or electrical hookup or gas hookup or water hookup. So when Mark Zuckerberg decides, I'm just going to claim that, I'm not going to check facts anymore, he shouldn't be allowed to just do that fait accompli. It's a utility, like a telephone, and there should be some regulation, shouldn't there? As these times intensify, accelerate, we're going to have to ask and resolve some of these questions in the common good, which hopefully still exist.